Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, I thought it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. Story 1, The Unzipping. I had chosen this spot for its seclusion, nestled deep in the forest where the trees grew thick and the underbrush was stubborn, clawing at my boots as I made my way to a small clearing. The sky had been a deep indigo when I set up camp, the last traces of twilight slipping behind the horizon. I had pitched my tent on a patch of moss that felt almost springy underfoot, and for a while, I lingered by the fire, letting its warmth seep into my bones. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional rustle of small animals and the distant cry of an owl, both sounds so familiar and ordinary that they felt comforting. I had gone camping alone countless times, and yet that night, something subtle gnawed at the edges of my comfort. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a prickling sense of being observed, a sensation I had learned to ignore over years of solitude. I brushed it off, telling myself I had pushed too far into the wilderness and that my imagination was simply responding to the shadows. I packed my fire down to glowing embers and crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the night breathe through the trees. At first, the sounds of the forest were soothing, a lullaby of life beyond human reach. Then, just as I was drifting off, I noticed something odd, a faint, metallic creak like fabric stretching. I froze, straining my ears, trying to place it. The sound seemed impossibly close, right outside my tent. My heart ticked up a notch. Maybe it's just the wind, I thought. The tent flap rustled again, a soft, deliberate movement, and I felt the heat drain from my face. The sound repeated there, then gone, then there again, a slow, careful unzip. My breathing grew shallow. I told myself it had to be an animal. A raccoon, maybe, or a curious fox. But the precision, the almost mechanical rhythm of it, felt wrong. It wasn't clawing or scratching. It was deliberate, intimate. Someone or something was outside, trying the zipper. I told myself to stay calm, to think rationally. I considered simply staying silent and waiting it out. My mind raced through the possibilities: a lost hiker, a prankster, or, God forbid, a criminal. I had my phone, but the signal was non-existent. I could reach nothing, and the isolation that had seemed enchanting hours before now felt suffocating. The zipper hissed again. I could hear it dragging slowly along the tent's fabric. The tent's nylon walls were thin. I could practically feel the pressure of someone's hand brushing against them, testing for weakness. I wanted to scream, to bolt, but my body refused to obey, pinned by fear and disbelief. "Who's there?" I finally whispered, my voice hoarse and small. The movement stopped. Silence. The forest pressed in around me. My pulse thundered in my ears. I told myself that if it was an animal, it would make a sound by now. But if it was a person, I had no plan. Nothing. I had walked into the heart of the woods and carried with me only a backpack and a flimsy tent. I debated my options. I could throw the tent open and confront whoever or whatever was there, but I knew I had no advantage. I could try to slip away into the darkness, but without my flashlight, I would be blind, stumbling among roots and rocks. I decided to wait, holding my breath, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. And then I heard it again, quicker this time. The zipper slid faster, almost impatiently. My stomach dropped. This was no lost camper. This was intentional. My rational mind fought to explain it, maybe a drunk hiker, or someone camping nearby. But even as I tried to reassure myself, the hairs on the back of my neck stood straight, and a low, metallic scrape echoed inside my skull, echoing from the thin walls of the tent. Panic rose in me like a tide. I remembered the small pocket knife I kept in my bag. My fingers fumbled over the fabric, finding it, gripping it like a lifeline. The zipper tugged once more, a final, deliberate attempt. I felt the brush of cold air where the flap lifted slightly, and I knew I could not remain passive any longer. I lunged, grabbing the zipper from the inside, yanking it down with every ounce of strength. The flap exploded outward, and I was met with nothing but shadows. The clearing was empty, the fire long extinguished by the cold night air. My heart hammered, each beat a drum of warning. I stepped outside, knife raised, eyes scanning. The forest was still. I could see no footprints in the damp earth, no movement, nothing but the trees, their branches twisted like skeletal fingers under the moonlight. The rational part of me wanted to convince myself I had dreamed it, that my fear had conjured a phantom. But the zipper's teeth, pressed down and slightly bent where my fingers had struggled with them, told a different story. I gathered my pack silently and unzipped the tent fully. Inside, everything was in order, as if no one had been there. The knife felt absurdly small in my trembling hand, useless against whatever had touched my camp. My mind raced. Was it a person? A spirit? Something else? I couldn't decide, and that uncertainty gnawed at me. I left the tent behind. I ran through the forest, the trees slapping my arms, roots catching my boots, but I did not slow. I did not look back. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I stumbled onto a trail I recognized from my earlier hike. The familiar path brought no comfort. My pulse was ragged, my vision raw from fear, but at least I could see signs of human presence. By dawn, I reached the nearest road, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the woods. A passing car slowed as I waved frantically. The driver stared at me as if I were insane, but I didn't care. I climbed in, shivering uncontrollably, and did not speak until we were well away from the forest. When I finally told someone the story, they asked if I was certain, if perhaps I had misheard. But I knew the truth. Whatever it was that had unzipped my tent, it had been deliberate, patient, and precise. It had tested me, measured me, and retreated without a trace. I never returned to that campsite. I never wild camped again. And sometimes, when I lie awake at night, I can still hear it, the faint, metallic hiss of a zipper, slow, methodical, and waiting. Story 2, The Tailgater. I had left the office later than usual that night, the clock hands mocking me as I shut down my computer and slipped into the empty streets. The city's neon lights faded behind me as I merged onto the outskirts, the hum of tires on asphalt the only soundtrack to my solitude. My route home was the same one I always took, a long, twisting road flanked by dense trees and the occasional dim street lamp. Normally, the drive calmed me after long hours under harsh fluorescent lights, but that night, a strange heaviness clung to the air, thick enough that I could almost taste it. I just passed the old gas station where the sign flickered sporadically when I noticed a car behind me. At first, it was unremarkable, a black sedan with headlights dimmed as if uncertain, keeping a careful distance. I glanced in the rearview mirror. It remained there. A little too long. I shrugged it off. Maybe another commuter, late for some errand. I adjusted the radio, trying to mask the unease crawling up my spine, and eased into a slower pace. The car slowed as well, narrowing my movements. A prickling sensation rose along my neck. My eyes flicked back and forth between the road and the mirror. Every turn I took, every gentle curve, it followed perfectly. If I slowed, it slowed. If I accelerated, it matched me. The precision felt deliberate, too deliberate. I told myself rational explanations. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the driver was lost and following the road exactly like I was. But the way it adjusted so perfectly to me, it didn't feel accidental. I took the next left, a slight bend where the trees grew thick and shadowed the pavement. The sedan followed. I felt a chill, a slow tightening in my chest. My hands gripped the wheel harder, knuckles pale. The thought occurred, what if it's not just coincidence? What if someone's watching me? I tried to laugh at myself, a hollow, short sound that did nothing to calm the rising dread. I reached for my phone, my thumb brushing the screen. No signal. Of course. The isolation that usually brought comfort now felt like a trap. Every bend, Every shadow curve seemed magnified. The road stretched like a tunnel of black, the trees leaning inward as if they were watching too. I tested my theory, slowing to 30 miles per hour. The car behind me slowed immediately, maintaining the same distance, almost patiently. My pulse thundered. I tried accelerating sharply, weaving slightly in the lane. It mirrored me perfectly. I tried to rationalize. Maybe a prankster? Some disturbed soul following me from the office? It didn't make sense, yet every instinct screamed danger. I had the keys in my hand, but the thought of pulling over, stepping out, confronting it was unthinkable. I felt trapped, my own movements watched, anticipated. My mind raced through options. I could turn onto the highway, seek other traffic, but the highway was miles ahead. And even if I found others, what would I say? A car is following me, mirroring me perfectly? It sounded insane. I was alone, and the dark, twisting road stretched behind and ahead of me like a waiting maw. Then the headlights shifted slightly, brightening in a sudden flare. A sense of menace crystallized in my chest. This was no ordinary tailgater. This was deliberate, patient, and, most terrifyingly, informed. Whoever or whatever was behind me, knew the road, knew how I drove. The thought struck me like a blow. This wasn't random. It was personal. Panic surged. I glanced at the speedometer. I couldn't outrun it. Every escape route I thought of, the highway, a side road, even turning back, was futile. The car adjusted to every change, anticipating, synchronizing. My hand shook on the wheel as I forced myself to breathe. Then I remembered the old ranger station about 5 miles back, abandoned now, but still a building. I could reach it. I could maybe lock myself inside. Desperation gave me focus. I swung the wheel sharply, heading for a dirt pull-off near the station. The black sedan followed without hesitation. My stomach dropped. It didn't hesitate. It didn't hesitate at all. I hit the brakes hard as I reached the station's decaying structure, the tires skidding on gravel. Heart hammering, I threw the car into park and scrambled out. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the hum of the engine behind me. I ran to the rusted doors, yanking at the handle. It held. I stumbled inside, listening. Outside, the sedan idled at the edge of the clearing, headlights cutting through the shadows. I held my breath, pressed against the cold wall, watching. After what felt like eternity, the engine revved and the car slowly backed down the road, disappearing into the blackness. I didn't move until dawn, trembling, too terrified to even think of leaving. When morning came, I walked back to my car, checking every inch for damage, every shadow for signs. There was nothing but my shaking hands and a lingering sense of violation. I drove home slowly, sticking to the highway this time, refusing to take the twisting back roads again. I never saw the black sedan again, but I could not shake the memory of it. It had followed me, anticipated me, mirrored me, as if it had been inside my mind. Rational explanations failed. Logic failed. And I knew, somewhere deep down, that night on that deserted road had been a test, and I had been lucky to survive. Story 3, The Hooded Man. I had been working the night shift at the petrol station for almost 3 years, and by now, the routine had become a kind of hypnotic comfort. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint smell of petrol, and the occasional chime of a customer buying snacks or fuel, all of it was ordinary, almost soothing in its predictability. That night, though, the ordinary began to fray at the edges. It was past midnight, the quietest hour when the streets outside seemed to hold their breath. I sipped lukewarm coffee behind the counter, watching the CCTV monitors with lazy familiarity. Most nights, I barely looked at the screens. Nothing ever happened. The odd car came and went, the odd person walked by, and that was it. I leaned back in my chair, the vinyl creaking under me, and let my eyes drift over the monitors. Then I noticed him. At first, I thought he was just another late-night pedestrian. A man in a dark hoodie, standing outside near the far end of the forecourt, hands in pockets, head down. Nothing suspicious, yet something about the way he stood, still and unmoving, felt wrong. I frowned, nudging the monitor to zoom in. He didn't move. Not a step. Not a glance. Just stood there, facing the building. I shook my head. Probably a drunk or someone waiting for a ride. I returned my attention to the register, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. But after 10 minutes, my gaze flicked back to the screen. He hadn't budged. 15 minutes. I began to feel a tightening in my chest. He was standing in a blind spot, just beyond the coverage of the CCTV cameras, the area that always made me slightly uneasy. I checked the feed from every angle. Nothing. Just the empty forecourt. And yet, I knew he was there. 20 minutes passed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The coffee had gone cold. I told myself he was harmless. Rational explanations, he was pacing himself, taking a break, waiting for someone. But the longer I watched, the heavier the unease became. My skin prickled as if the air itself had thickened around him. I tried to engage in ordinary tasks, restocking shelves, wiping counters, but every movement made me glance back at the monitors. Every glance revealed the same thing. He hadn't moved an inch. I began to notice small, unsettling details. His hoodie was pulled low over his face, and I couldn't make out a single feature. His hands were tucked inside, and sometimes, just barely, I thought I saw him tilt his head, listening. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it's a mannequin someone left outside. Maybe my eyes are playing tricks on me in the low light. 35 minutes. I could feel sweat pooling along my spine. My heart thumped in irregular bursts. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the walkie-talkie to call the manager, then froze. The manager would ask why. He would say I was overreacting. I swallowed hard, telling myself to keep calm. I returned to the counter and tried to act normal. The door chimed once as a car pulled in, but it was empty, someone long gone before I could reach them. I glanced back at the monitors, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't before. His position hadn't shifted in nearly an hour, yet the shadows around him had moved. The streetlight above flickered occasionally, and each time, it revealed a glimpse of something unnatural in his posture, too rigid, almost like he was waiting, not just standing. His presence had begun to dominate the space. The air on the screen seemed heavier. I could almost feel it pressing down. I tried to convince myself it was fear talking. I was alone, exhausted, working a night shift that turned the mundane into paranoia. But the hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood straight, and a cold sweat coated my forehead. I could not ignore it any longer. Finally, I stepped out from behind the counter, convincing myself I would catch him in the act, maybe confront him, maybe just scare him away. I walked toward the sliding doors, the floor tiles cold beneath my feet, each step echoing too loudly in the empty space. And then I saw him, not just on the monitor, but in the forecourt. Standing exactly where I had seen him before. Only now, he wasn't facing the building. He was looking straight at me. I froze. His hood still obscured his face, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze, a weight that seemed to pierce through the glass. I could see the slight rise and fall of his chest, slow and deliberate. I wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but my mouth was dry. My body refused. I stepped back inside, the sliding doors clicking shut behind me, and I grabbed the emergency phone to call the police. My fingers fumbled. And then the lights flickered. The CCTV monitors blinked off, one by one, leaving the shop bathed in the cold yellow glare of the fluorescent ceiling lights. I heard the soft, unmistakable scrape of shoes on the concrete outside, followed by a deliberate, measured pause. My stomach dropped. The sound was right there, just beyond the door, in the blind spot I had dreaded. My mind raced, rational explanations fled, replaced by a raw, visceral terror. I picked up the heavy metal rod I kept under the counter, the only thing I had between me and him. My pulse was a drum in my ears. And then the door handle moved. Slowly. Deliberately. I swung the rod with everything I had, and the glass shuddered, but there was nothing there. Silence. Cold, heavy, suffocating silence. I backed away, toward the corner of the shop, as if hiding could protect me from the impossible. Minutes passed. I could hear nothing beyond my own ragged breathing. When I finally dared to look outside, the forecourt was empty. Not a trace. No footprints, no car, nothing. The shadowy spot beyond the CCTV feed was vacant, as if he had never existed. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn came, I left the petrol station and didn't return. The manager asked why I quit so suddenly, and I said nothing. Weeks later, I learned that a man fitting the same description had been seen lurking around several night shift petrol stations in the area. Some employees reported feeling watched. Some disappeared. Authorities never caught him. I never went back. And sometimes, late at night, when I pass an empty petrol station, I see a flicker in the shadows and feel the same weight of ice pressing through the darkness. He waits. He always waits. Story 4, The Warm Campsite. I had set out that morning with the intention of a long hike, the kind where hours pass unnoticed beneath the canopy of pine and oak, the forest swallowing you whole in its quiet rhythm. The trail had been marked at first, a neat line of blazes up the slope, but by mid-afternoon, I realized I had wandered off it. The markers had grown sparse, trees and underbrush obscuring the path, and the sun was dipping lower, turning the woods into a patchwork of shadows that seemed to shift in the corners of my vision. At first, I was calm. I had done plenty of solo hikes before. I knew how to navigate, how to stay put and wait if necessary. But as the minutes turned into an hour, the unease began to creep in like frost along the edges of a window pane. Every bird call seemed distant, echoing oddly. Every rustle of leaves sounded too deliberate, too precise, as if something unseen was mimicking the forest itself. I tried retracing my steps. I marked trees with rough scratches, memorized the positions of rocks and roots. Yet the more I moved, the less familiar everything became. I passed the same twisted oak 3 times, its gnarled roots rising like the fingers of a sunken hand. Panic prickled in my temples, but I forced myself to breathe, to stay rational. "I'll find the trail soon," I whispered. As twilight deepened, I stumbled over a mossy rock and tumbled down a shallow slope. I landed hard, scraping my palms, and sat up, swearing softly. It was then that I noticed a faint, orange glow ahead. I froze, scanning the trees. The glow pulsed, steady and calm, like a heartbeat. A campsite. I blinked, unsure if my eyes were playing tricks. There was no smoke rising, no sound of voices, just the warm glow of a fire, perfectly contained within a circle of stones. The logs glowed red at their edges, and a thin wisp of smoke curled upward as if the fire had only recently been fed. There was no one around. No tents, no sleeping bags, no signs of movement at all. I approached cautiously, every nerve alert. The warmth of the fire washed over me as I stepped close, a contrast to the chill settling in my bones. I called out softly, "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed immediately by the forest. No answer. I told myself there must be a rational explanation. Someone had set up camp and gone for water, or perhaps wandered down the trail. But something about the scene felt off. The fire was too neatly arranged, too carefully maintained, as if waiting. And the forest around it seemed unnaturally still. Not just quiet, silent in a way that made every creak of a branch unbearable. I circled the fire slowly, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. Nothing. Only the faint smell of wood smoke, the heat radiating against my cold skin. Then I noticed it, footprints. Not many, just a few around the fire, but they were strangely deep, unnaturally precise. No mud, no dirt scattered, just clean impressions pressed into the forest floor, like they had been etched deliberately. I felt the first real spike of fear. My hands were clammy, my pulse thundering. I wanted to step back, to run, but the trail behind me had disappeared completely. The trees had shifted, or perhaps I had. The familiar landmarks were gone. I was trapped. I sat on a nearby log, forcing myself to breathe, trying to make sense of it. Then I saw movement, not people, not animals, but something in the shadows just beyond the firelight. It was subtle, a shifting of shapes that shouldn't move. I squinted. The darkness seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. And then I heard it, a faint whispering, impossible to place, coming from every direction at once. My rational mind screamed for explanations. Whined through the branches. My imagination playing tricks. Exhaustion. Yet my gut told me otherwise. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness just beyond the fire. I could feel a presence, patient and deliberate, moving in tandem with my own fear. I stood slowly, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm leaving," I said aloud, though the sound felt hollow. The fire flickered suddenly, a sharp gust of wind or something else, and I caught a glimpse of movement, fleeting and fluid, vanishing behind a tree. My heart jumped into my throat. I turned to leave, stepping carefully over roots and rocks, but the trail was gone again, replaced by unbroken forest. The shadows around the fire had deepened, pressing closer, consuming the familiar shapes of the trees. I tried to call out again, but no sound would come. My throat tightened, panic spiraling. And then I saw them. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the light. But the shapes became clearer, emerging from the edges of the firelight. Figures, tall, thin, their faces obscured in shadow, standing perfectly still just beyond the warmth. They didn't move toward me, yet I could feel their attention, like a weight pressing down, bending the air itself. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes, roots threatened to trip me, but I ran blindly, guided only by desperation. Behind me, the whispering grew louder, coalescing into words I could not understand, guttural and ancient, dripping with malice. The fire behind me flickered one last time, then died. The forest swallowed the glow, the shadows blending into one endless darkness. Hours, or maybe minutes later, I stumbled onto a trail I recognized. The sun was just beginning to rise, pale and gray. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. When I finally reached the road that led back to civilization, I collapsed into my car, hands shaking uncontrollably, eyes darting to every shadow. I never returned to that forest. Later, I read reports of hikers who vanished in those woods, others who described strange fires and footprints appearing out of nowhere. I don't know what I saw that night, or why it had not attacked me outright, only waited. But I remember the warmth of that fire, the patient, watching shapes, and the way the forest itself seemed to breathe around me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I dream of that fire. And I wake up drenched in sweat, convinced that whatever waits in the shadows is still patient, still waiting for the next wanderer to stumble too close. Story 5, The Muddy Bootprints. I had been asleep for hours when Max started growling. At first, I thought it was a dream, a half-formed irritation in my subconscious, but the sound grew louder, sharper, more insistent. I rolled over and rubbed my eyes, squinting at the digital clock, 3:03 a.m. The house was still, the kind of still that presses against your ears until every creak and pop is amplified. Max's growl was low, vibrating through the floorboards. I froze, listening. He was at the back door, hackles raised, teeth bared beneath his lips. I could feel the tension coiled in his body like a spring ready to snap. My first thought was that some animal had wandered into the yard, a raccoon, a stray. Rational explanations. Yet when I looked out the window, the yard was empty. Moonlight fell across the grass, illuminating nothing but dew and shadows. I stood, pulling on a robe over my pajamas, trying to ignore the tightening in my chest. Max's growl deepened as I approached the door. I reached for the handle, and that's when I saw it, muddy boot prints pressed into the back porch. Not a few, a trail led right up to the door, the treads fresh, edges crisp, as if someone had walked deliberately to the threshold and stopped. No footprints led away. My throat went dry. I blinked, thinking I must be seeing things, but Max whined, pacing in small circles, eyes locked on the prints. My mind raced through every rational possibility. Maybe someone had walked past earlier, forgotten they'd left tracks. No. Too fresh. Rain hadn't fallen, the ground was dry. No wind had swept the porch. And yet the prints were undeniable, the mud dark against the weathered wood. I grabbed a baseball bat from the corner, every step toward the door heavy with tension. Max pressed himself close to my legs, growling intermittently, ears flat, tail stiff. I cracked open the door a few inches, peering into the yard. The garden was empty, the trees swaying gently in a cold breeze, the grass shimmering faintly in the moonlight. "Hello?" My voice sounded hollow, swallowed immediately by the night. No answer. No rustle. Only the faint whistle of the wind through the trees. I stepped outside, bat raised, scanning the perimeter. The yard was pristine. No signs of movement, no shadow darting between the bushes, nothing. And yet, the prints at the porch told a different story. Someone had been here, standing silently just beyond the door. My stomach clenched. The rational part of me screamed for reason. Maybe a prank? Someone casing the house? Maybe I'd left the door unlocked earlier in the evening? And then I noticed something I hadn't before. The footprints weren't uniform. One print was slightly deeper than the others, pressed into the wood like someone had shifted their weight, lingering. It was deliberate. Watching. Waiting. I backed into the house, shutting the door slowly, the click of the lock louder than it should have been in the quiet. Max pressed against my side, ears swiveling toward every creak, every whisper of the wind. I turned on every light, checking the windows, the porch, the driveway. Nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just a neighbor's kid, a harmless late-night wanderer. I tried to sleep again, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the deep print at the door, felt the eyes behind it, waiting. Hours passed, the night stretching on. Max eventually curled up beside me, but I couldn't sleep. I replayed the scene over and over, mind racing. Rational explanations ran thin. Someone could have entered through the yard, maybe left for some reason, but then, why leave the prints? And why not move? My heart thudded as I considered the thought I didn't want to acknowledge. Whatever had been at the door hadn't left because it wasn't planning to. I tried to shake the dread. Morning would come, light would wash away shadows, and the prints would look like nothing more than mud smeared by some careless passerby. But as the first pale rays of dawn crept over the rooftops, I found myself unable to move from the couch. My eyes stayed fixed on the back door, the porch, the garden, waiting for some explanation I knew wouldn't come. It wasn't until the mail arrived that I realized how wrong I had been. Max's ears pricked up again, but this time he didn't growl, he stared rigidly at the porch. I followed his gaze, and my stomach dropped. The muddy boot print I had noticed the night before, it was now leading away from the house. Slow, deliberate, as if someone had finally decided to step back into the world. I grabbed the bat again, rushing outside, but the print stopped just at the edge of the yard, vanishing as though the earth had swallowed it whole. No sound. No figure. Only the fading warmth of the morning air and the lingering scent of wet earth. Weeks later, I learned of a man who had been following houses in the neighborhood at night, hiding in shadows, watching families, never entering, never leaving a trace until he chose to move on. They never caught him. They only found his tracks in the mud outside homes, always fresh, always deliberate, never consistent, as if he could appear and disappear at will. I never stayed home alone after that. Max always slept close to the back door, ears perked, tail stiff, watching the night. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind rustles just right, I swear I can hear the soft press of boots on wet wood, circling the house, waiting for the moment I least expect. I don't know if he ever wanted to enter. I don't know if he ever even existed in the ways I understood. But I know the truth of the footprints. He had been there, he had watched, and he could come again. Story 6, The Stranger Offering a Ride. I had been driving for hours, the empty stretch of road unfolding like a ribbon through the barren landscape. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, leaving a bruised sky and a rising cold that seeped into the car's interior. My plan had been simple: drive through the night, make it home before dawn. But plans rarely survive long in the middle of nowhere. It started as a sputter, a hesitation in the engine I ignored at first. The car coughed, shuddered, and then died completely, the dashboard lights flickering once before extinguishing. I turned the key again, nothing. Panic rose in the pit of my stomach. I was alone, miles from the nearest town, no cell signal, no streetlights, only the endless dark stretching in every direction. I grabbed my phone, hoping for some connection, but there was nothing, no bars, no calls, not even the faintest indication that anyone else might be near. I leaned back in my seat, staring out at the black road, trying to calm myself. The only sounds were the wind brushing against the car and the faint rustle of something in the roadside brush. My mind offered the usual rationalizations. The battery could have died, the fuel line could be clogged, someone might come by eventually. And then I saw the headlights. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a trick of the dark. But the lights grew closer, piercing the night with deliberate clarity. A car pulled up slowly behind mine, headlights dimmed, engine idling. I froze, hand trembling over the door handle. The car stopped a few feet away, a shadowed figure visible behind the wheel. He got out. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. His face was obscured by the brim of a hat, the shadow of the night swallowing most of his features. Yet there was something unsettling in the way he moved, slow, deliberate, measured, like a predator circling. Car trouble? His voice was casual, almost friendly, but it carried an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. "Yes," I said, forcing calm into my voice. I think it's dead." He nodded, stepping closer, too close. "I can help you. You shouldn't stay out here alone. Cold, dangerous. Come on, get inside. My car's warm." I laughed nervously, a short, brittle sound. "No, thank you. I'll wait for someone to pass by." He tilted his head, studying me, and a smile crept across his face, slow and unnatural. "You won't want to wait. Not out here. Not alone." Rationality fought to assert itself. He was just trying to help. Perhaps he had tools, maybe a tow line. But instinct screamed otherwise. Something in the way he stood, the way his eyes seemed to follow every micro-movement I made, set my nerves on fire. "I'm fine, really. I can manage." He stepped even closer, and I noticed his hand resting casually near his pocket, where a flashlight or worse might be. I shook slightly, gripping my keys like a talisman. "Please. I'm okay. I'll figure something out." The smile widened, slow and deliberate, teeth flashing in the dim light. "It's not safe out here. Not for someone like you. Come on, get in. You'll see." My heart raced. Each rational thought was countered by a spike of primal fear. Something wasn't right. He wasn't just offering help. He was insisting, pressuring. There was a weight in his gaze that felt like it could crush me if I didn't comply. I glanced back down the road, black, empty, infinite. My car, a half-finished meal of metal and wires, offered no sanctuary. The only movement in the world was him. I swallowed hard. I had to act. I pretended to reach for my phone. "Let me just call for a tow," I said, keeping my voice steady. "They'll be here in a few minutes." He didn't move back. Didn't blink. "Call them? Won't be here in time. You'll freeze. Come on, just get in." I knew I had to run. I gripped my keys, fumbled with the door, and flung it open, stepping back toward the ditch that ran alongside the road. I bolted, heart hammering, adrenaline screaming. Branches tore at my arms, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't stop. I could hear him behind me, shuffling, not running, but methodical, each footstep perfectly paced to follow. I stumbled into the darkness, lungs burning, until I reached a small bridge over a creek. The sound of running water was a lifeline. I paused for a heartbeat, listening. Nothing. Just my ragged breathing. I turned, terrified, and the man was there, standing at the edge of the road, watching. He didn't move. Just waited. His hat tipped, his smile wide and unnatural, and for a moment, the world seemed to still, the night itself holding its breath. I realized then that this wasn't about fixing a car. This wasn't a kindness. It was about control. He wanted me to obey, to step into his vehicle, to vanish into the darkness with him. I shivered violently, forced myself to run again, deeper into the forest lining the road, guided only by instinct. Hours later, I found a highway. Cars passed, bright lights cutting through the pre-dawn haze, horns blaring as I waved frantically. One of them slowed, and I sprinted toward it, shouting, gasping, my voice breaking under fear and exhaustion. The driver opened the door, staring at me with wide eyes, and I practically fell into the seat. I didn't stop trembling until I reached the next town, safe under the fluorescent lights of a 24-hour diner. I reported the incident to the police, gave them what description I could, but by the time I returned to the area, there was no sign of him. No car. No footprints. Only the memory of his insistence, his smile, and the way the night itself seemed to bend around him. Weeks later, I read of a missing persons report in a neighboring county. The details were vague, but the circumstances alone, stranded on a remote road, a stranger offering help, matched too closely. I don't know what became of him, and I don't want to. I keep my car in top condition now. I check the weather, the fuel, everything. I avoid isolated roads after dark. And sometimes, when the wind whistles across an empty highway, I imagine headlights in the distance, a smile in the shadows, waiting for the next traveler foolish enough to believe someone out here is simply being kind. I survived, but the memory follows me. It waits in the quiet stretches of night, patient, deliberate, and infinitely dangerous. Story 7, The Children's Laughter. I had been hiking all day through the national forest, my boots coated in mud, my backpack heavy with water, snacks, and the gear I insisted I'd never forget. By late afternoon, I found a clearing far from any main trail, an area where the trees thinned, and the ground was soft and level, perfect for setting up a tent. The sun slanted through the canopy in golden beams, and I felt a rare kind of peace, the sort that comes from being miles from anyone or anything. I pitched my tent with the usual methodical routine, hammering stakes and securing guy lines, letting the repetitive motions calm my mind. I boiled water for dinner over my small stove, the hiss of the flame and the scent of instant noodles grounding me. The forest was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and distant birdsong. I had this sense of ownership, as if the woods had temporarily agreed to exist solely for me, a fragile bubble of solitude. Night fell quickly. The sun disappeared behind the trees, and the forest swallowed the clearing in shadows. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped the tent just enough to keep the chill out, and lay back, staring at the faint outline of branches through the nylon walls. Max, my small terrier mix, curled at my feet, his ears twitching occasionally as he sniffed the air. That's when I heard it. Soft, faint, and impossibly clear, the sound of children laughing. I froze, my hand pressing against Max to steady him. The first laugh was high-pitched, giddy, fleeting, as though it belonged to a group of kids chasing one another in the dark. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Maybe hikers had set up a campsite nearby. Maybe a group of families had wandered off the trail. Yet, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness through the thin fabric, I saw no lights, no flash of reflective jackets, no flicker of lanterns. The nearest campsite marked on the forest map was miles away. The laughter continued, soft at first, then louder, closer, circling the tent. I could hear the cadence of little footsteps on the forest floor, the rustle of dry leaves under tiny feet. My pulse raced. My rational mind floundered. Perhaps I'm tired. I've been alone all day. Maybe I'm imagining it. I whispered Max's name. He crawled low, a guttural rumble that made the hair on my arms stand up. The laughter didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to respond to my voice, stopping when I spoke and resuming when it went quiet. I tried to convince myself it was an echo, some strange acoustic effect caused by the trees, but the laughter shifted position, moving around the tent. I could hear it on my left, then right, the tiny footfalls circling deliberately. I forced myself out of the sleeping bag, the cold nylon brushing my skin, and zipped the tent halfway open. The laughter paused. My flashlight's beam cut a narrow path through the darkness. Branches, roots, shadows, everything was ordinary. Nothing moved. No children. Nothing but the forest, dense and still. I shook my head. It's just my imagination, I muttered, but my voice sounded tinny and small in the darkness. Max whimpered, pressed close to my side, ears flat. I felt a creeping awareness that I wasn't alone in the way I had thought I was, like the forest itself had shifted, like something was waiting. The laughter began again, louder now, overlapping in multiple tones, as if more than one child circled me simultaneously. It had an unnatural quality, like an echo stretched too long, layered, discordant. I could swear I heard whispers between the laughs, words I couldn't understand, gibberish or some language I didn't know. Panic rose, a cold wave that made my fingers tremble on the flashlight. I considered leaving, but my rational mind froze with fear. The forest was dense, leaving the clearing meant stumbling blindly through roots and rocks, potentially falling, getting lost further. The laughter moved closer to the tent, and I could hear it directly outside the thin nylon walls, soft thumps on the dirt, brushing against the sides. My heart pounded so loudly I thought they might hear it. I tried to call out. "Hello? Who's there?" My voice cracked. Nothing but silence and the rustle of leaves. Then a high-pitched giggle, almost directly behind me. I spun, flashlight sweeping the empty clearing. Shadows moved, but nothing solid emerged. Max barked furiously, teeth flashing, but even he seemed uncertain. The fear became a physical weight, pressing on my chest. I zipped the tent fully closed and pressed against the back wall, flashlight in hand, scanning through the tiny peephole. And then I saw them. Tiny shapes no taller than 2 feet glimpsed between the trees. They moved too fast, darting in unnatural, jerky motions. Their faces were obscured, or perhaps featureless, but the way they shifted and danced in the shadows carried a malicious intelligence. I froze, realizing the laughter was not accidental, not playful, it was deliberate. It was meant to draw me out, manipulate, terrify. I considered running, screaming, anything, but my body refused. I was rooted, trapped by the sheer impossibility of what I saw. Max whimpered again, pressing close to me, but even he refused to leave my side. The shapes stopped suddenly, freezing in unnatural poses, heads tilted toward me, silence pressing down. Then, a single, slow clap echoed from the darkness outside the tent. One small hand, too long, too pale, tapped against the nylon wall. I screamed, grabbed my flashlight, and bolted, yanking the tent door open. Max leapt beside me, barking furiously. I ran blindly through the trees, branches clawing at my clothes, roots threatening to trip me, adrenaline fueling my escape. The laughter followed, overlapping, echoing from every direction, until I stumbled onto the trail I had intended to hike the next morning. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched the forest floor, I was out of the woods. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, and when a passing car slowed, I flagged it down, shaking uncontrollably. The driver stared at me, bewildered, but I couldn't speak, couldn't explain. Only point back toward the forest, where shadows lingered in the corners of my vision. I never returned to that campsite. Maps, guides, even ranger records confirmed there were no families in the area, no other hikers that night. And yet, the memory of the laughter, the rapid, deliberate footsteps, and those shadowy, impossible figures, featureless, darting, intelligent, remains vivid. Some nights, I lie awake and swear I can hear the echoes of giggles just beyond the walls of my house. Max curls close, ears twitching, and I know they wait, patient and deliberate, for the next wanderer who ventures too far into the quiet. I survived, but I am never alone in the dark. Story 8, The Man Following. It was just past 11 when I left the pub, the streets slick with rain and glimmering under the dull glow of streetlights. I had been visiting an old friend, catching up over a few pints, nothing unusual. The city was quiet for a Friday night, the kind of empty that makes every sound, footsteps, distant engines, the clatter of a sign in the wind feel exaggerated. I pulled my coat tighter and headed down the side streets, the familiar route home unfolding like a path I had walked hundreds of times. I noticed him first in the reflection of a shop window. A man, tall, hooded, hands buried in the pockets of a dark coat. He didn't do anything, just walked, keeping pace a little behind me. I squinted, trying to place him, a passerby, someone I hadn't noticed in the crowd. But as I took the next turn, a small lane I used to shortcut around a block, I realized he followed. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was coincidence. London is a big city, streets twist and fold back on themselves. I could have imagined it. Maybe he was heading the same way, maybe he lived nearby. I shook my head, laughed at my own paranoia, and kept walking. The second turn was a narrow alley between two brick buildings, the kind that smelled faintly of damp and old smoke. My boots echoed on the cobblestones. When I turned again, glancing over my shoulder, he was there. Same figure, same hood, same deliberate pace. My rational mind raced. Maybe he was just walking the same route. Maybe he had errands nearby. He had something about the symmetry of it, the way he appeared at 3 consecutive turns, made my skin crawl. I stopped at the corner, pretending to tie my shoelace. He slowed too, his shadow stretching along the brick wall like an extension of him. I forced a laugh, glanced up casually, and he froze. No casual glance, no hesitation, just that stillness, like a predator waiting. My heart thumped against my ribs, a loud, insistent drum. I moved again, faster this time, toward a larger, busier street. Cars passed, splashing puddles along the curb, and I tried to blend into the crowd. But as I turned for the third time, an intersection I knew like the back of my hand, he was there again. Same hood, same posture, same slow, deliberate stride. My mind screamed for explanation, but none came. Rationality slipped, leaving only dread. I ducked into a side street, hoping to lose him, hoping for a break in the symmetry. The narrow lane smelled of damp bricks and the faint tang of old garbage. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and ragged, echoing against the walls. Somewhere down the alley, there was a faint footstep, a soft, deliberate sound, matching my own pace. I stopped abruptly. So did he. My breath hitched. I considered running, but the alley was enclosed, the walls close, my escape limited. I turned slowly, shining my phone flashlight in all directions. Empty. Nothing. Just shadows stretching and folding in the weak light. Yet the feeling remained he was there. Watching, waiting. Patient. And impossibly still. I forced myself to walk again, this time with purpose, head down, trying to ignore the echo of footsteps behind me. Every step I took, a faint sound followed, perfectly timed, perfectly matched. My rational mind ran through possibilities, a mugger, a lunatic, a prankster. But none of them could explain the precision. The pattern. The way he mirrored me, turn after turn, stop after stop. I took a sharp turn onto a broader street, one with a few cafes still open and a neon glow in the distance. I thought for a moment that maybe the lights, the people, would break the spell. I slowed at the crosswalk, hoping to let a car pass, needing a distraction. And yet, even there, the shadow lingered. I couldn't see his face beneath the hood, couldn't see any detail, but the outline was unmistakable. Panic began to claw at my stomach. I ducked into a small, convenience store, trying to act casual, hoping he wouldn't follow. The bell above the door jingled, and I let out a silent sigh. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed softly over shelves of canned beans and detergent. I watched the entrance from behind the counter, pretending to browse. Minutes passed. Empty. No hooded figure. I debated leaving. Should I call the police? Go back the way I came? Rationality and fear warred in my chest. I finally convinced myself the man had turned back. Maybe he had been lost. Maybe he had seen someone behind him and been startled. Reasonable, plausible. Yet my hand shook as I paid for a bottle of water, trying to calm the heat rising in my cheeks. I stepped back onto the street, forcing myself to walk quickly, eyes darting in every direction. The city felt different now, hostile, every shadow too deep, every alley too dark. I kept my pace steady, trying to convince myself I was imagining the precision, the symmetry, the mirroring. But then I heard it, a soft shuffle behind me, almost imperceptible, but timed with my steps. I spun around. Nothing. Just the street, the glow of neon, the distant murmur of traffic. My pulse was thunderous in my ears. I walked faster, then jogged, trying to put distance between myself and whatever it was. The next turn took me onto a park path, lined with trees that clawed upward, branches tangled against the night sky. I slowed for a moment, listening. Footsteps. Behind me. Perfectly matched. I stopped. So did they. I turned sharply and saw him at the edge of the path, just beyond the light of a lone street lamp. Same hood, same posture, same unsettling stillness. My rational mind crumbled under the weight of instinct. I ran. Branches whipped my face, roots snagged my boots, but I didn't stop. The footsteps behind me were no longer soft, now deliberate, following, unwavering. I burst onto a larger road, illuminated and busy, people moving in clusters, cars honking. I dove into a taxi, panting, shaking, slamming the door behind me. The driver glanced at me curiously. Everything all right? I didn't answer. I just urged him to go. As we drove off, I dared to look out the rear window. The path behind me was empty. No shadow. No hooded figure. But the feeling lingered, the patient, deliberate presence, following, waiting, always there. I made it home before dawn, locked the doors, checked the windows, and poured myself a coffee I barely drank. Rationality returned slowly, but the memory of those mirrored steps, those stops perfectly timed with my own, gnawed at me. Weeks later, I read about a string of disappearances, all in similar neighborhoods, all at night, all involving reports of a hooded man who followed without speaking, perfectly matching his victim's movements before vanishing. I had survived, but I could never walk alone at night again. And sometimes, when the wind whistles along the empty streets, I swear I can hear him, just behind me, waiting for the next turn. Story 9, The Elevator. I had stayed late at the office tower that night because deadlines don't care about 11 p.m. or about loneliness. The fluorescent lights of the 27th floor flickered faintly, buzzing intermittently, a sound that felt almost sentient in the quiet. The hum of the air conditioning was the only constant, blending with the occasional creak of the building settling, a reminder that I was alone. Well, supposedly alone. I sat at my desk, the glow of my monitor illuminating the paperwork spread around me. Emails answered, spreadsheets updated, but the pile of work never seemed to shrink. I rubbed my eyes, the skin tight and dry. My watch said 11:16 p.m. The elevators had been silent for hours. The doors never opened unless someone called them. I was the only one on the floor, everyone else had gone hours ago. I leaned back in my chair and let my mind wander. The office was normal, beige walls, glass partitions, chairs neatly tucked beneath desks. Nothing extraordinary, nothing that would make me uneasy in the daylight. But at night, the same familiar space becomes a cage. Shadows pulled in corners where the light didn't reach, and every reflective surface, windows, polished desks, a chrome handle, seemed to deepen the darkness. That's when I heard it, the soft, metallic ding of the elevator. I froze, fingers hovering over the keyboard. My stomach flipped. I hadn't called it. I hadn't pressed the button. The sound echoed off the walls, low and deliberate, like a signal rather than an accident. My first thought was that maintenance might be working late, a technician moving between floors. I tried to shake off the unease, but the elevator doors began to slide open, slow, mechanical, and perfectly aligned with the floor I was on. Empty. I exhaled sharply, my shoulders tense. Maintenance, I muttered to myself. Rational. Reasonable. I told myself the night staff might be inspecting the floors, that the elevator system had quirks. I was tired, overworked, maybe imagining patterns. Yet, even as I tried to calm my racing mind, the space between the elevator's threshold and the floor felt wrong. Too still. Too quiet. I returned to my desk, attempting to focus. But I could feel it, the subtle shift in the room. The air seemed heavier. The shadows deeper. My monitor reflected a pair of faint, irregular movements behind me, and I spun. Nothing. Just my chair, my pile of files, my reflection in the glass. I shook my head, tried to focus on work. The clock ticked slowly, each second a drumbeat in my ears. Then, another ding. The elevator doors. I didn't hear them move. They were just open. Wider this time. And I knew, with a sick certainty, that no one had called it again. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. The building's security cameras? They were probably offline for the night. Maybe the elevator had a mechanical glitch. Maybe I'd imagined it. I told myself it was impossible for anyone to reach my floor without the security panel unlocking it. But instinct pressed against my skull with insistent urgency. I wasn't imagining it. I stood, cautiously, and walked toward the elevator. The carpet muffled my steps. My reflection shimmered in the stainless steel doors. As I drew closer, I noticed a detail I had ignored. The elevator floor was not the bright beige it usually was. It was dark, almost black, the overhead lights out, leaving only the faint glow of the call panel. The metal walls reflected something wrong. A figure. I froze, hand trembling on the door frame. The reflection wasn't clear, more a shadow than a person, but I could feel eyes, if not literal, then metaphorical, pressing into me. Waiting. I backed away slowly, and the figure seemed to tilt its head in response. Hello? My voice was brittle, echoing oddly through the empty office. No reply. Only silence. The elevator remained open, empty yet oppressive, a void that seemed to inhale the air around it. I stepped back to my desk, heart hammering, trying to rationalize. Security would call it in the morning. I just had to wait. I resumed my seat, hands shaking as I attempted to log off my computer. And that's when I heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps on the carpet behind me. I froze. Max, my neighbor's dog, had no reason to be here. The building's cleaning staff had left hours ago. I told myself it was the hum of the air conditioning, the building settling, but the steps came closer. 1, 2, 3, each precise, matching the rhythm of someone walking directly behind my chair. I twisted, catching only the edge of a shadow in the corner of my eye. It disappeared immediately, but the temperature dropped. My breath fogged faintly in the unnatural chill. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy stapler, and turned fully, ready to confront whatever it was. Nothing. The elevator dinged again. Doors sliding open and closing, a rhythm now, deliberate and synchronized with the footsteps. I tried to call for help on my phone, but no signal, of course. I tried the intercom. Silent. The elevator's mechanical hum seemed to mock me. I realized then, with a sick clarity, that whatever was here had known I was alone. Had known exactly where I would be. The building itself had become a trap, my ordinary office a cage, and the elevator the lure. The footsteps stopped. Dead silence. Then, faintly, from the elevator, a whisper. Not words. Just a sound that pressed against my skull. I backed against the wall, clutching the stapler, breathing harshly. Every rational explanation had fled. Fear clawed at me. My desk, the chairs, the ceiling tiles, all of it suddenly seemed alien, hostile. The elevator doors opened fully, and a darkness spilled out, more absolute than shadows should be. It expanded, reaching toward me with impossible depth. I screamed and bolted for the stairwell, ignoring the protest of my legs and lungs. I ran down 3 flights of stairs, heart hammering, adrenaline consuming every rational thought. Behind me, a low, resonant thrum echoed through the stairwell, the elevator, following. Sliding, descending, arriving where it shouldn't, pursuing. I burst into the lobby, the automatic doors parting just in time for me to stumble out into the night. The streets were empty, save for a lone security camera blinking in the distance. I ran, never looking back, until the glow of a 24-hour diner offered safety. I collapsed into a booth, shaking uncontrollably, sipping coffee I didn't taste, watching the dark city streets for any sign of the impossible. When I returned with the morning, the elevator was normal. Maintenance confirmed no one had used it. The system had no record of calls from my floor that night. The building, the office, the elevator, everything ordinary. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know the elevator will always be waiting, patient, deliberate, for the next person foolish enough to be alone at night. I survived, but the memory follows me. Always. Story 10, The Backpack and the Lake. The morning had started innocuously enough. I woke before dawn, packed my tackle box, and drove the hour out to Cedar Lake, a secluded body of water tucked deep into the woods. I liked the isolation, the quiet, the way the mist hovered over the surface as if the world itself were holding its breath. The roads were empty, lined with birches and pines, and the only sounds were my tires crunching on gravel and the faint whistle of wind through the branches. I parked at the small dirt clearing near the dock, grabbed my gear, and walked down the uneven path. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of wet leaves and moss. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, leaving the water in a muted palette of gray and silver. I set up my rod, untangled my line, and cast into the calm water. At first, everything was ordinary. The gentle lapping of the lake against the wooden dock, the occasional splash of a fish, the distant cry of a loon. But after a while, I began to notice things. Small, almost imperceptible details that didn't quite fit. A single boot print in the mud at the edge of the dock, half erased, but fresh enough to disturb me. A faint ripple in the water near the reeds, though I hadn't disturbed that part of the lake. A lingering smell, metallic and sharp, like iron or blood, faint enough to dismiss at first, but persistent. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps someone had been here yesterday, fishing, lost their balance and stepped into the mud. The smell may be rust from the dock nails or stagnant water mixing with leaves. My heart rate settled, slow and deliberate, as I tried to focus on the water. I caught a fish, small and wriggling, and felt the familiar satisfaction of the simple routine. I returned it to the water, still casting, still listening to the soft symphony of the lake. But the unease lingered. The ripples I had seen before returned, moving in patterns that suggested something under the surface. Something watching. I leaned over the edge of the dock, shining my flashlight into the gray depths. At first, I saw nothing. Just shadows shifting beneath the water, reeds waving. Then, something caught my eye, a shape, half submerged near the bank. My stomach turned as I recognized it, a backpack, dark and soaked, tethered just enough to float. I froze, heart hammering, the air suddenly heavy and suffocating. The bag moved slightly, as if nudged by something under the surface. Every rational explanation in my mind scrambled, fighting against the gnawing dread. Perhaps someone had left it behind. Perhaps it belonged to another fisherman. But then the unmistakable scent reached me, iron, thick and acrid. Blood. I edged closer, my boots scraping against the weathered planks of the dock. The backpack floated eerily still now, water dripping from its seams. My hand shook as I grabbed it, hauling it onto the dock. The fabric was slick, saturated. I unzipped the main compartment, and my stomach lurched violently. Inside were clothes, soaked through with dark, congealing blood. Shirts, pants, a jacket stained in a way that suggested not just an accident, but violence. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the dock, the reality pressing down like a physical weight. Rational thought failed me. Panic clawed at my chest. My first instinct was to call 911, but my phone had no signal. I dropped the backpack, stumbling to the edge of the dock, scanning the tree-line. Nothing. Only the still, reflective water and the rising mist, obscuring everything beyond the small clearing. The lake, once serene, now seemed like a dark mirror, holding secrets too vast and ancient to comprehend. I could hear the faint splash of something moving beneath the surface, and my mind leapt to worst-case scenarios. What if the person, if there even was one, was still in the water? Watching. Waiting? I forced myself to breathe, to slow down. I needed a plan. The nearest ranger station was nearly 2 miles back through the forest. I could run, leave the backpack, get help. But the rational part of me clashed with fear. What if someone or something followed? The isolation that had once comforted me now became a cage. I grabbed my fishing rod as a weapon, my hands slick with sweat. Slowly, I approached the edge again. The water rippled, faintly, almost teasingly. I could see nothing now, only shadows shifting. I realized then that the backpack had been weighted down in a particular way, almost as if it had been deliberately placed in the water. But why? And by whom? A rustle behind me snapped my head around. The trees shivered in the breeze, or maybe something moved within them. I could hear it, a footstep on fallen leaves. Another. Then silence. My breath hitched. Whoever or whatever had left the backpack was still here, somewhere in the misty forest, watching. I had to move. I sprinted along the path back to the road, boots slipping in the mud, heart hammering. My ears strained for any sound, every snap of a twig sending a jolt through my body. When I finally reached the clearing where I'd parked my car, I was shaking uncontrollably. The backpack, still half submerged in the distance, remained. I drove the winding roads back to the main highway, finally spotting lights of the first open gas station. I pulled over, gasping, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I called the police, reporting the incident, my voice trembling so violently I could barely be understood. Officers later confirmed that a missing person report matched the description of the clothes. A young man had disappeared while camping near Cedar Lake. No other witnesses, no evidence beyond what I had found. I never returned to the lake. The memory of the cold, slick fabric, the smell of blood, and the eerie stillness of the water that hid secrets too vast to confront follows me wherever I go. I can't fish anymore. I can't drive past isolated lakes without gripping the wheel too tightly, imagining shadows moving beneath the surface. I survived, but Cedar Lake never lets go of its secrets. Story 11, The Stranger Knocking. The night was quiet, quieter than usual, and I liked it that way. My apartment sat on the 4th floor of a brick building, the kind with squeaky elevators and thin walls, but at 10 p.m. everything felt empty, suspended, almost sacred. I had spent the evening reading, a cup of tea beside me, the lamp casting a warm pool of light across my living room. Outside, the streetlights hummed faintly, painting long shadows across the pavement, and the occasional car passed with a soft roar, fading almost instantly. I was about to turn off the light when I heard a knock at my window. A soft, hesitant tap, like a cautious question. My heart skipped a beat. The window overlooked the fire escape, narrow and old, with rust eating through the metal. I rose and peered through the blinds. A man stood there, hooded, his face obscured in shadow. The glow from the street lamp behind him cast his silhouette into a dark, featureless shape. "Hi," he said, his voice rough, low, but not overtly threatening. "Can I use your phone?" My first reaction was disbelief. A stranger on a fire escape at night, asking to use my phone. My apartment wasn't on the ground floor. Why here? Why now? "No," I said firmly, stepping back. "I'm sorry. I can't." The man nodded slowly, almost respectfully, and I thought maybe it would end there. He remained silent, watching me, hands in his pockets. I could feel my pulse in my ears. Something about his stillness made the air heavy. Then I noticed it. Another shadow. Larger, darker, moving just behind him, slinking along the edge of the fire escape, against the wall. At first, I thought it was my imagination, perhaps the hood casting a longer shadow, the streetlight exaggerating shapes. But the movement was deliberate, separate from the man in front. It shifted in a way no natural shadow would, crawling along the brick with an almost liquid grace. I backed away from the window. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a passerby walking past, a trick of perspective, a branch brushing the wall. But even as I told myself this, the shadow shifted again, peering around the first man, its head tilting unnaturally, slow, deliberate. My skin prickled. My stomach knotted. The stranger's voice broke the silence, soft and insistent. "I really just need to make a call. Please." "No," I said again, firmer this time. My fingers hovered over the blinds, ready to slam them shut if necessary. But before I could move, the shadow behind him detached, stepping fully into view. I could see it now, tall, impossibly thin, its limbs long and crooked, head hanging slightly, as if gravity had no effect on it. Its face was featureless, smooth, yet somehow aware, somehow intelligent. It mirrored the man's posture but did not breathe, did not blink, and yet it radiated attention, focus, and intent. I stumbled backward, tripping over the corner of the rug. The man in the hood shifted his weight slightly, but did not move toward me. The shadow, however, tilted its head in tandem, a mirror image of deliberate observation. My pulse pounded in my ears, heart racing as my mind alternated between disbelief and sheer terror. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my throat had gone dry. I grabbed my phone, pretending to dial 911, though I wasn't sure I could form words. The shadow flinched subtly, the hooded man taking a half step backward, as if my movement had broken an unspoken pact. Yet the presence remained, a palpable weight outside my window, stretching beyond explanation. I cursed myself for living so high up, thinking it would be safe, thinking walls and elevation could protect me. I knew then that logic didn't matter. Reason didn't matter. Something was out there, and the ordinary rules of the world no longer applied. I considered throwing something at the window, breaking it to scare them off, but hesitation froze me. My apartment was my only sanctuary. Beyond it was nothing but darkness, and whatever had accompanied the stranger was patient, deliberate, waiting for me to make a mistake. The first man finally stepped back, muttering something I couldn't hear over my own panicked heartbeat. I pressed myself against the wall, shaking, breath shallow. The shadow lingered for a moment, head tilted, then melted along the brick like smoke, disappearing down the fire escape. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building, every hiss of the radiator, felt like a whisper, a reminder that it was out there. I double-locked the door, closed the blinds, even pressed myself against the window at one point, listening. But silence answered. The next morning, I looked out from the safety of daylight. Nothing on the fire escape, no footprints, no evidence of the previous night's encounter. I told myself it was over. I told myself rational explanations existed, a prank, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, stress. But the memory of that shadow, crawling, deliberate, aware, stayed with me. Weeks later, I learned of a series of incidents in the city, strangers appearing at windows, asking innocuous questions, followed by witnesses reporting strange, humanoid figures just beyond them, vanishing without trace. My blood ran cold. I realized I wasn't imagining it. I had encountered the same pattern, the same presence. I moved shortly after that to a ground floor apartment with a doorman, hoping distance and company would give me peace. Yet I cannot walk past a window at night without instinctively checking for shadows, every flicker of movement triggering the memory. And sometimes, when the wind rattles the blinds or a car passes on the street, I swear I see it just beyond the glass, a shape that waits, patient, deliberate, silent. I survived, but I will never forget. And I know that one night, it could return. Story 12, Hidden Trail Cameras. It started as an ordinary Saturday morning. The sun was just spilling over the horizon, golden and low, catching the dew on leaves along the Northwood Forest Trail. I had been biking this trail for months, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. Today, I was alone. My tires crunched on the packed dirt, rhythm steady, lungs filling with the crisp, pine-scented air. The forest was alive with birdsong, the occasional rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, but otherwise tranquil. The first hour was nothing unusual. I passed familiar bends, low-hanging branches, the stream I always stopped to glance at when I needed a break. I felt free, unburdened. The path wound upward gently, the trees thickening around me, their shadows stretching long in the morning sun. Then, I saw it. A small black box attached to a tree at eye level. I slowed, squinting. It looked like a trail camera, the kind hunters used to monitor wildlife. Odd, but not alarming. People sometimes left them around here. I nodded and pedaled past, telling myself it was harmless. A few minutes later, I noticed another. This one angled precisely toward the path, just ahead of a sharp bend. My stomach tightened. 2 cameras in a row? Coincidence, I reasoned. Someone must have left them to observe deer or foxes. But the precision nagged at me. Each camera seemed carefully positioned, calculated, almost anticipatory. I picked up speed, trying to shake off the unease. The trail narrowed as I entered a thicker grove, moss soft underfoot, roots weaving like veins across the dirt. And then, I began to see more of them. Cameras at regular intervals, all facing the trail. Some perched low, some high, all pointed directly at the path I followed, as if awaiting my presence. Panic nudged at my rational mind. Maybe it was a park project, wildlife research, or a survey. But the placement, the sheer number, and their pointed precision, it didn't feel like research. It felt targeted. I dismounted to inspect one, gripping my handlebars as I approached the nearest tree. The lens stared up at me, black and unyielding. My reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. I took a photo with my phone, intending to document the strange setup. That's when I noticed the straps. New, tight, unweathered. Not old equipment abandoned in the woods. Someone had put them here recently. I mounted my bike again, chest tight, mind racing. Every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. I could almost feel eyes on me, not just the cameras, something else. My pace quickened, but the trail twisted and turned. Ahead, I saw more cameras, then more, each one perfectly framing the path as if they had been set to track every motion. A rational voice tried to speak. Maybe this was part of a hunting club, or pranksters from the nearby town. Maybe it wasn't dangerous. But deep in my chest, a visceral sense of wrongness grew. Something about this, about the quiet coordination, about the way the forest seemed to close in, was off. I passed a cluster of cameras near a fallen log. One of them clicked faintly, shudder-like. My blood ran cold. The sound was subtle, mechanical, but deliberate. As I rode past, I looked back briefly and saw movement too deliberate for a deer, too coordinated for a fox. Something or someone was crouched just beyond the tree line, watching, hidden. I accelerated, tires skidding slightly on loose gravel. Branches scraped my shoulders, but I didn't slow. The trail climbed steeply, roots snagging my wheels, but I didn't care. All I could focus on was the feeling of being hunted, tracked, cataloged. The cameras were no longer benign. They were markers, indicators of intention. Another cluster came into view. This time, one camera was angled slightly lower, nearly at my chest level as I passed. I froze mid-pedal, heart hammering, and my eyes caught something deeper in the trees. A shadow, elongated, unnaturally still, following me between the trunks. My rational mind screamed that I was imagining it, that fatigue and fear were distorting shapes, but instinct shouted louder, it was real. I tried to convince myself to turn back, but the trail behind me curved sharply into dense underbrush. The shadow had disappeared, or maybe it hadn't moved. My panic surged, and I pedaled faster, heedless of roots, rocks, and uneven terrain. My lungs burned, legs shaking. Every bend revealed more cameras. More lenses, all facing me, all catching my flight, all recording. I glanced to the left where the underbrush thickened, and I saw it clearly now. A figure, thin, tall, cloaked in the forest's shadows, moving with a predatory grace. Its head tilted unnaturally, following my progress. The cameras blinked faintly as I passed, some with infrared glints catching the sunlight, reflecting briefly in my panicked eyes. I took a sharp turn onto a familiar downhill stretch, hoping to reach the road, to escape into civilization. But the shadow followed, slipping between trees effortlessly, almost gliding. I risked a glance behind, only to see movement along every tree line, coordinated, deliberate. I couldn't identify individual shapes now, just the collective awareness of being watched, tracked. The final stretch opened into a clearing. I spotted the road, asphalt cutting through the green. Relief surged, and I pedaled harder, muscles screaming. The shadow didn't pursue openly now. It lingered at the edge of the trees, still, patient, as if respecting my flight or perhaps waiting for the next moment to strike. I reached my car and threw myself into the driver's seat, shaking uncontrollably. I glanced back toward the forest. Nothing. No figure, no movement. Only the trees, the sunlight catching on leaves, the trail seemingly abandoned. The cameras were gone, or perhaps dismantled and carried away in silence. I drove home without stopping, hands gripping the wheel, knuckles white, heart still hammering. Sleep eluded me for nights. Every creak of a door, every shadow in my peripheral vision, sent my mind spinning back to that forest trail. Weeks later, I learned about a series of disappearances in Northwood, hikers vanishing on familiar trails, cameras discovered afterward. Some had been filmed in detail, some never seen again. I survived, but I know now that the forest is not empty, and that the cameras were only one part of the machinery watching me. I never return to Northwood, never ride trails alone, never trust the quiet. But sometimes, when the wind shifts through the trees, I swear I can feel it, the patient, deliberate observation of someone or something, waiting for the next person to peddle into its lens. Story 13: The Locked Tent. I had always loved camping alone. There was a freedom in it, the quiet of the forest, the way the wind rustled through the trees, and the endless sky stretching above me, unhindered by streetlights or city noise. That weekend, I had chosen a remote site deep in Pine Hollow, miles from the nearest trailhead. My tent was pitched near a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines whose needles blanketed the forest floor in muted green. The air was crisp, and the smell of wet earth mixed with pine resin in a way that made me feel alive. The first night had been uneventful, which I welcomed. I cooked my dinner over a small campfire, the flames crackling softly, then retreated into my tent with a book. Outside, the forest hummed with nocturnal life, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The world felt safe, familiar. I slept soundly, cocooned in my sleeping bag, the fabric of the tent brushing softly against my skin. Morning arrived with a soft light spilling through the tent fabric. Birds were singing, and dew sparkled on the grass beyond. I yawned, stretched, and reached for the zipper to slide it open. My fingers met resistance. I frowned and tugged gently, but the zipper wouldn't budge. At first, I thought it was stuck, maybe caught on the fabric. I tugged harder. The fabric didn't snag, it was as if the zipper had been tied from the outside. My pulse quickened. I tested it carefully, feeling the strange, unnatural tautness. I stepped back and surveyed the tent in disbelief. The flap hung as it always had. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been here. The ground was soft from overnight dew, undisturbed except for my own prints from setting up. My rational mind tried to assert control. Maybe I had somehow looped the zipper incorrectly the night before. Perhaps the wind had twisted it. But nothing in my experience with camping explained the taut resistance I felt, like a rope had been pulled through the teeth of the zipper. I grabbed a stick and tried to pry the zipper open. There was no give. Panic started to rise, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. My breath came faster. I peered through the thin tent fabric, scanning the clearing. Everything seemed normal. The fire pit was cold, the surrounding pines stood silent. Yet something was off. The quiet felt too heavy, too deliberate, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I tugged at the zipper again, my mind racing for explanations. Could it have been an animal? A curious raccoon, perhaps? But no raccoon could have looped a zipper with such precision. My hands trembled as the weight of the thought pressed down on me. Someone had been here. Someone had been outside my tent in the night, and they had tied it shut while I slept. I strained to listen. The forest was alive with its usual morning sounds, the chirping of birds, a distant brook, but beneath that normalcy, my ears caught the faintest crunch of leaves. Slow, deliberate, moving closer to the clearing. My stomach dropped. Whoever had done this might still be nearby, watching. I searched the tent for anything I could use to cut the zipper. My pocket knife was in my pack, just out of reach. I considered climbing out over the tent wall, but it was high on a small rise, and the sides sloped steeply. Fear gnawed at me, a persistent, insistent weight. The forest, once comforting, now felt like a trap. The shadows between the trees seemed too deep, the light of day failing to penetrate fully. I inched my hand toward my backpack, every motion deliberate, trying not to make a sound. Then, a faint sound carried through the air, the soft snap of a branch, distant, deliberate. My heart pounded. I froze, listening. Another step, closer this time. Whoever had tied my zipper was still in the vicinity. I gritted my teeth and took a calculated risk. I yanked the tent fabric sharply, hoping to tear the zipper or at least create an opening. The fabric ripped slightly, enough to slip a hand inside. I worked the knife free, and with a few desperate slashes, I cut the ties and unzipped the flap. Fresh air rushed in, sharp and cold against my sweating skin. I scrambled out of the tent, I stared into every shadow. The clearing was empty. No footprints, no signs of anyone hiding in the pines. Only the morning sun breaking through the canopy, painting the ground in golden streaks. My rational mind tried to rationalize it again. Maybe the forest played tricks on me. Maybe I had been half asleep when I felt the zipper tied. But the cold knot in my stomach refused to be dismissed. I packed up quickly, scanning the tree line constantly, and decided to abandon the site altogether. My bike was parked a short distance away, leaning against a tree. I jumped on it, pedaling fast, heart hammering, the wind slicing past me as I navigated the familiar trail back to the road. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, every rustle in the underbrush triggering a spike of terror. When I finally reached the safety of my car and started the engine, the forest behind me seemed impossibly still. I drove without stopping, hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. Weeks later, I learned from a local ranger that Pine Hollow had a history of incidents, hikers and campers reporting feeling watched, tents tampered with, belongings moved. Some accounts described figures glimpsed in the early morning shadows, disappearing before anyone could identify them. I never returned to that trail. I don't camp alone anymore. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still feel the taut resistance of that zipper. I can hear the faint crunch of leaves in the distance, deliberate, patient, waiting. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that someone or something was out there that morning, watching me sleep, and it will be out there again for the next person foolish enough to be alone in the woods. I survived, but Pine Hollow's forest keeps its secrets. And it keeps its watchers. Story 14, The Missing Friend. I had never liked camping, really, but my friends insisted. They had a way of making any outing sound like a grand adventure, and I, never one to say no, had relented. We chose a small clearing deep in Ravenwood Forest, far from the main trailhead, a place the maps barely marked. It was late summer, the air still warm but crisp with the early morning chill, the ground soft with pine needles and fallen leaves. Setting up the tents had been straightforward enough. I claimed the corner of the clearing with my own small green dome, my friends' tents clustered nearby. We gathered wood for a fire, the crackle and pop of flames filling the evening, and roasted marshmallows as the sky turned dark, the forest closing in around us like a velvet curtain. Laughter echoed between the trees, and for a brief moment, the world felt insulated from anything bad. Night arrived quickly. I tucked myself into my sleeping bag, the tent walls flapping gently in the breeze. Somewhere outside, an owl hooted. Somewhere else, the faint rustle of small animals skittered across the underbrush. I drifted to sleep, comforted by the warmth of my friend's presence just a few yards away. I woke with a start before dawn. My head was foggy, my mouth dry. Something felt wrong. I blinked at the dim light filtering through the tent fabric. The fire from last night was nothing more than a smoldering pile of ashes, and the clearing was silent, eerily so. My stomach turned. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. At first, I thought I had just slept later than everyone else. But the sight that greeted me stopped my breath. One of our group, Eli, was missing. His tent, a bright red dome, was still set up, undisturbed, but the flap hung open. There was no sign of him, no gear missing, no footprints leading out of the clearing. Only the faint ash of last night's fire, cold and gray, and the soft whisper of wind through the pines. I called out his name. Eli? My voice sounded strange in the heavy stillness, swallowed almost immediately by the forest. Silence answered. I hurried to the other tents. Mira and Jordan were both still asleep, or so I thought. I shook them awake. Their eyes were heavy, groggy. Eli's gone, I said. He didn't pack up or anything, he's just gone. They blinked at me, confusion slowly turning into a peculiar blankness. What are you talking about? Mira asked, her voice tentative. Eli never came out here last night. My stomach dropped. What? That's impossible. We all set up camp together, cooked dinner, watched the fire. He was right there. Jordan shook his head. No. I was here. We came together. Only the three of us. There was no Eli. I laughed nervously, trying to dismiss the gnawing fear twisting in my gut. I must have been dreaming, hallucinating, a product of exhaustion and the campfire's heat. But the memory of him laughing, passing me the marshmallows, the way he teased Mira as he built the fire, was vivid, sharp, undeniable. Panic rose in my chest. No, you don't understand, I said, my voice trembling. He was here. I saw him. A sudden rustle in the trees interrupted me. I froze. The wind had shifted. Something moved slowly, deliberately, between the trunks, just beyond the clearing. I squinted, trying to see. The shadows stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that made my stomach turn. Mira and Jordan looked at me, concern flickering across their faces, but still blank, detached. What is it? Mira asked. There's something out there, I whispered, my fingers tightening around a stick. My mind reeled. Perhaps it was an animal, a deer or a bear, though I had been in these woods enough to know the signs didn't match. This was deliberate. Observant. Patient. Waiting. I backed toward the tents, heart hammering. Every instinct screamed to leave, but the other's calm dismissal made my skin crawl. I realized then that whatever had taken Eli, or whatever I had seen last night, was still out there, just beyond the line of firelight and safety. The forest seemed impossibly quiet, yet alive with intent. I decided we had to leave. Quickly, quietly. I packed my gear, urging Mira and Jordan to do the same. Their movements were mechanical, eerily synchronized, eyes flicking to the forest but showing no real fear. I tried to tell myself they were in shock, that my imagination was exaggerating, but a primal instinct whispered that something was wrong beyond explanation. We started down the trail toward the parking area, the forest closing in, shadows pooling where light failed to penetrate. And then I saw it, a figure, pale and thin, moving between the trees, watching us. Not running, not hiding. Watching. My stomach dropped, and I stumbled, nearly falling over a root. The figure didn't move closer, didn't retreat, but the weight of its attention pressed on me like stone. When we finally reached my car, relief surged, but I didn't breathe easy until I was rolling down the highway, headlights cutting through the misty pre-dawn. I glanced at Mira and Jordan. They looked at me blankly, as if my fear were unfounded, as if I had imagined everything. I wanted to ask them again, but the words died in my throat. Later, I called the ranger station, reporting Eli missing, detailing everything I remembered. They promised to send search parties, but when I described my friend's reaction, they were hesitant. Sometimes people misremember who was present, the ranger said gently. Trauma can do that. I couldn't sleep for nights. The memory of Eli's laughter around the fire, his casual grin, the way he had brushed past me, it was seared into my mind. And the way the forest had felt alive, aware, patient, waiting for me to step into the wrong moment. I never returned to Ravenwood. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't hike trails in remote forests. And sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I see him, Eli, just at the edge of the shadows, smiling, the same way he did that night. But when I tell myself it's only memory, I remember the blank looks on Mira and Jordan, and I realize I might have been the only one who ever saw him. Whatever took him, whatever lingered in the woods that night, I survived. But I know now that some places remember, and some presences wait, patient and deliberate, until the next person sees what shouldn't be seen. Story 15, The Diner Visitor. I had always liked the quiet of closing time. The diner was a small, old-fashioned place, neon lights buzzing faintly outside the windows, chrome stools lying neatly along the counter, and the scent of coffee lingering like a memory. I usually stayed late to clean up after the rush, stacking dishes, wiping down counters, and taking inventory of the registers. It gave me time to think, or, more often, to forget to think. That night, it had been especially slow. Only a couple of lingering customers, everyone polite, gone by 10:30. I turned off the main lights, leaving just the faint glow of the neon sign and a single overhead lamp in the back. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the wall clock were the only sounds. I was mopping the floor near the back exit when the first sound reached me, a rattling at the front door. I froze, mop in hand. The door was locked. I had locked it. My heart thumped, but I told myself it was probably just the wind, the old frame shifting against the latch. I went back to mopping. Then came another sound, a soft, deliberate jiggle at the side door. I paused again. No wind could have reached that far. My pulse quickened. I wiped my hands on my apron and peered through the small window of the back door. Empty parking lot. Shadows stretching along the asphalt, cast by the flickering neon outside. I tried to laugh it off, muttering to myself about loose locks and the building settling. But as I turned to finish cleaning the counter, I heard it again, a muffled, metallic scrape, this time at the delivery entrance. My stomach sank. Someone was going around the diner, checking each access point. I hurried to the office and double-checked the locks. All secure. I tried the radio, calling for a patrol, but the line was dead. I cursed under my breath, realizing the storm from earlier might have taken out the service line. The diner felt suddenly small, confining, the shadows stretching longer, closer, in the corners of my eyes. I grabbed a broom as a makeshift weapon and moved to the counter. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified, every tick of the clock like a drumbeat. The rattling had stopped momentarily, but I knew better. The quiet was heavier than the sounds. It was a weight pressing in, waiting. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Then, from the front, a soft thud, footsteps, deliberate, slow, scanning the glass. I couldn't see clearly through the windows, the neon sign casting a pinkish glow that distorted the shapes outside. I stepped back, breathing shallow, trying to convince myself it was someone lost in the parking lot, confused, harmless. Another sound at the side door. It rattled, more insistent this time, the handle turning slightly. Whoever it was knew the doors were locked. They weren't random. My mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. I considered calling out, threatening them, but the thought of confrontation froze me. I retreated to the kitchen, moving quietly, heart hammering. My mind swung between rational explanations, maybe a delivery driver confused, maybe a prank, but instinct screamed at me that this was deliberate. Patient. Targeted. I reached the back exit and pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear. Silence, save for the refrigerator's low hum. Then a soft scraping noise along the wall. Something moved outside. I could feel it in the vibrations of the floor, the subtle shudder of the building. It wasn't fast, but it was deliberate, systematic, checking every point of entry. I retreated further, toward the small office with the only phone line in the building. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the receiver. Dead. I sank to the floor, pressing the broom to my chest like a talisman. A shadow flickered past the window. My stomach dropped. It was tall, slight, moving with a deliberate, almost stalking grace. My rational mind screamed at me, someone outside, a homeless person, a prowler, but the way it moved, methodical and aware, didn't match anything human I knew. My breath caught. Then a knock, soft at first, deliberate, at the back door. I could hear it in the pause of my own heartbeat. I didn't respond. The sound repeated, increasing slightly in intensity. I held my breath. Another knock, then the metallic rattle of the handle. Someone was trying to force it. I scrambled toward the kitchen exit, realizing it was no longer about locks or windows, it was about survival. The figure outside moved to the side, then the front, always just out of clear view, testing, patient. I could see its outline against the neon, tall and thin, the hood of a jacket shadowing its face. It never ran, never made a sound besides the deliberate manipulation of the doors. It didn't need to. The tension alone was enough. I bolted for the delivery exit, careful not to make noise. The figure shifted, as if aware of my movements, and I could feel it in the way the air pressed against my skin. I burst onto the alley behind the diner, lungs burning, broom abandoned, and didn't stop until I reached my car at the far end of the lot. Once inside, I locked the doors, fumbling with the keys to start the engine. My hands shook violently. I glanced back once, through the rearview mirror. The alley was empty. No sign of the figure, no footprints, no evidence that it had ever been there beyond the lingering sense of being watched, tracked. I drove for miles, not daring to stop, until the neon of the diner disappeared in my rear view. Only then did I allow myself to breathe, though the tremor in my hands remained. I reported it to the police later, describing the methodical nature of the figure, the way it had tested every entrance. They were polite but skeptical, suggesting maybe it was a prank, a vagrant, nothing more. I survived that night. I returned to work a week later, but the diner never felt the same. Every locked door, every window, every flicker of the neon sign reminded me of that figure, patient and deliberate, testing the perimeter, waiting. I never saw it again, but I knew, with an icy certainty, that it hadn't stopped watching. Even now, months later, when I work alone after closing, I can't shake the memory of that night, the rattling, the careful circling, the weight of deliberate observation pressing through the walls. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear it again, somewhere just outside, patient, testing, waiting for the next door to unlock. Story 16, The Arrows in the Forest. I had always been drawn to the solitude of the mountains. The way the trail wound through dense forest, the whisper of the wind in the pines, the occasional flash of wildlife, it felt like freedom, like the world had paused and I was the only observer. I chose a backcountry campsite deep in the Hemlock Range, far from any marked trailhead, where the map barely registered a squiggle of a path. The day was bright, the sky in endless blue above the canopy, and I felt untouchable. I hiked in early morning, the ground damp with overnight dew. My boots crunched softly against pine needles and loose soil. Birds flitted overhead, their calls echoing through the valley, while somewhere in the distance a creek burbled quietly. I stopped occasionally to catch my breath, drink from my canteen, and marvel at the sheer quiet, the way the forest seemed to breathe along with me. The campsite was perfect, a small clearing, ringed by towering trees, with a flat patch for my tent and a stone circle for a fire. I set up quickly, pitching my green dome and arranging my backpack just so. I gathered firewood and started a small blaze, the smoke curling lazily toward the treetops. I cooked a simple dinner, the smell of sautéing vegetables and toasted bread mingling with pine resin in a way that made my mouth water. Night fell without incident. I settled into my sleeping bag, the fire reduced to embers, and listened to the forest around me, the hoot of an owl, the distant rustle of small mammals, the gentle sigh of wind through branches. Sleep came easily, a rare and satisfying exhaustion. I woke long before sunrise. The sky was still dark, a deep indigo between the trees. Something felt off. My stomach nodded. I unzipped the tent slightly to peek out, and that's when I noticed it carved into the trunks of the surrounding trees, arrows. Simple, jagged marks, pointing in various directions. My first thought was that hikers had left trail markers, but these were too precise, deliberate, freshly carved, the sap still glistening in the morning light. Curiosity mingled with unease. I grabbed my pack and followed the nearest arrow, the forest suddenly feeling unfamiliar. The trail was faint, overgrown with ferns and roots, the scent of damp earth stronger in the cooler morning air. Another arrow appeared ahead, then another, carved carefully at eye level. They weren't random. Someone or something was guiding me somewhere. I rationalized, telling myself it was an old surveyor's marks or remnants of a forest maintenance crew. But as I continued, the forest began to feel oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, Every snapping twig sounded louder than it should. Shadows between the trees seemed to stretch unnaturally, shifting in ways that made my stomach churn. Hours passed, though the light was changing quickly. I stopped frequently, scanning the underbrush for signs of life, squirrels, deer, birds, but the forest seemed unnaturally quiet, empty. The arrows never wavered, always pointing ahead, always freshly carved, as though someone had been keeping pace with me. A tight panic began to coil in my chest. I considered turning back, retracing my steps, but every tree I passed revealed another arrow, pointing forward, deeper into the forest. My rational mind screamed at me, why would someone carve arrows to trap a hiker? But instinct whispered, insistent and cold, that something was wrong beyond logic. The path twisted and rose steeply, roots snaring my boots, branches scraping my arms, yet I felt compelled to follow. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like a branch breaking under weight, deliberately placed, echoing in the distance. I froze. Silence followed, thick and heavy. My pulse hammered, and the hairs on my neck stood on end. Another arrow appeared. I realized then the horrifying truth. The markings weren't guiding hikers forward, they were hurting me. Every choice I had made had been anticipated, every step directed. My stomach lurched, and I felt a cold sweat bead on my forehead. I broke into a run, the uneven ground tearing at my legs, roots snagging my boots. My heart raced as I stumbled blindly, trying to find a ridge, a creek, anything familiar. Then I saw it, the clearing ahead. My own campsite. The sight made my chest tighten. I hadn't realized how far I'd wandered. I had thought I was deep in uncharted forest, but the arrows had led me back. I reached the fire ring, still cold from last night, and the tent, still standing, everything as I had left it. Relief surged, but it was short-lived. Every tree around the clearing now bore arrows, pointing inward, toward me, newly carved, gleaming faintly in the morning light. My blood ran cold. I scanned the edges of the clearing, heart hammering. The forest was alive with deliberate, hidden motion, shadows moving in unnatural synchrony, just beyond the pines. I could sense them watching, patient, calculating, waiting for me to react. My rational mind tried to assert itself. There were no people, no predators, just my fear, but instinct screamed that I was not alone. I grabbed my pack and ran, skirting the clearing, heading for a ridge I remembered from yesterday. Branches tore at my sleeves, roots snagged my boots, but I didn't care. I didn't dare look back. The arrows had stopped at the clearing, but I knew they would appear again if I faltered. The forest seemed to shift with me, corridors of trees bending subtly, herding me further into itself. Hours later, I emerged onto a fire road, bruised and exhausted, the early morning sun finally breaking the canopy. I collapsed against a tree, gasping, scanning the forest behind me. The clearing, the arrows, the deliberate path had vanished into the normal randomness of trees and underbrush. Nothing remained to prove the deliberate orchestration of my panic. I never returned to that campsite, never hiked alone in Hemlock Range again. And though months have passed, I still see the arrows in my dreams carved into every tree, pointing, always pointing, hurting me towards something I cannot name. I survived, yes, but the forest knows my presence now. And somewhere in its depths, it waits, patient, deliberate, carving its warnings into the bark, always anticipating the next wanderer who follows. Story 17, The Open Front Door. I had agreed to house sit for my friend's suburban home on the edge of town, a quiet neighborhood where the most exciting thing usually was the sound of sprinklers turning on in the early morning. The house itself was normal, a modest two-story with beige siding and a small garden, neat hedges lining the front yard. My friend had left with a smile, handing me the keys and warning me to lock up tight and enjoy the quiet. I assured them I would. Evening fell easily. I cooked a simple dinner in the kitchen, the smell of garlic and sautéing vegetables filling the air. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling were the only sounds. I lit a single lamp in the living room, flipping through a book while sipping tea. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, occasional barking from a dog, the distant roar of a car passing along the main road. I had locked the doors carefully after dinner, testing each one, hearing the satisfying click of deadbolts securing them. Everything felt normal, comfortable, safe. Night arrived, and I decided to stay up a little longer, finishing the book. When I finally went to bed, I double-checked the locks again. Front door, deadbolt engaged. Side door, secure. Back door, nothing could possibly have been missed. I slipped under the covers, my bedroom dimly lit by a night light that cast a warm circle of light on the floor. The house was quiet, the calm kind of silence that invites sleep without worry. I woke abruptly around 3 a.m. at first to a faint creak somewhere downstairs. My mind brushed it off. It was common for old houses to make noises as they settled, and the floorboards in this one were particularly sensitive. But as I lay there, straining to listen, I caught a second sound, the soft, unmistakable creak of a door opening. My heart hammered. The front door. I had locked it, double-checked it. I froze, listening. The faint whisper of wind? No. The air was still, and the moonlight on the walls betrayed no shifting shadows from outside. Yet the door had opened. I slipped from bed, careful not to make a sound. My bare feet pressed against the cold hardwood, every creak amplified in the silence. I crept to the top of the stairs and looked down. The front door was wide open, a pale swath of moonlight cutting into the hallway. My stomach churned. Nothing in the yard moved, no figure, no car, nothing, but the door was open, swinging slightly with the night breeze. I shook my head. Perhaps the lock had failed, I thought. I'd been thorough, though. Too thorough. I climbed down slowly, keeping my eyes on the doorway. Every instinct screamed at me to call the police, but my phone was charging upstairs. I was alone. The thought of someone inside the house, waiting, hidden somewhere, tightened my chest. I grabbed a kitchen knife, the weight solid and cold in my hand, and moved through the house. Every room was empty. Living room, dining room, kitchen. I checked every closet, every hallway. No one. No signs of forced entry beyond the front door swinging open. The rational part of my mind wanted to believe I had simply forgotten to secure it, or that the lock had malfunctioned. But the unease in my gut wouldn't let me. Then I noticed something, the faintest smudge on the doorknob, just inside, where my friend's polished brass should have gleamed. Fresh fingerprints, greasy and dark in the moonlight. My pulse quickened. Whoever had opened the door had been inside, had touched the knob, had walked through my safe, quiet house without leaving a single sound behind. I backed away slowly, heart pounding, and went to the phone upstairs. The line was dead. My hand shook as I picked up my phone from the charger, no signal. I felt trapped. The house, which had seemed so ordinary and safe, now felt like a cage, the walls closing in. I realized then that I was not imagining it. Someone had been in the house, someone had left it open deliberately. And they were likely still nearby. My gaze flicked to the window beside the front door. No footprints in the dew-covered grass. No car. The air outside was empty. Yet the feeling of being watched pressed on me, patient, deliberate. I decided I had to leave. Slowly, I crept back downstairs, knife in hand, eyes fixed on the front door. I reached it, pushed it gently. The wind had stopped, the door hung perfectly still, the night quiet again. I stepped out, every nerve taut, and ran to my car, the dewy grass cold beneath my bare feet. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sat there trembling, listening. The neighborhood remained quiet, but I couldn't shake the certainty that I was being observed. I drove for miles, my heart hammering, thinking about what had happened. The logical explanation that someone had simply left the door ajar, that I had imagined noises, didn't sit right. It had been too deliberate, too precise. Someone had been in my friend's house, in my friend's absence, knowing I would be inside. Someone had touched the doorknob, entered and left with perfect silence, and left me with a cold, unmistakable proof, that door wide open, waiting for me to notice. I never returned to that house. My friend came back days later, oblivious to what had happened. I told him nothing, though my hands still shook when I thought about it. Whoever had come inside had vanished without a trace. But sometimes, when I'm home alone, I think of that front door. I imagine it swinging wide in the night, the faint imprint of fingers on the knob, waiting. And I know, deep down, that they could come back. I survived that night. But the knowledge that someone could be inside my world, moving unseen, patient and deliberate, lingers. And I know, without doubt, that next time, I may not be so lucky. Story 18, The Wandering Flashlight. Camping alone had always been my way to escape. Not to be social, not to be brave, just to be alone. The forest offered a quiet I couldn't find in the city, the soft rustle of leaves, the murmur of distant streams, the occasional caw of a crow. I had pitched my small green tent in a clearing by the edge of a pine grove, away from the main trail, far enough that no other campers would stumble across me. The sun was setting as I finished organizing my gear, the last light filtering through the trees and painting everything in burnt orange and gold. Dinner was simple, instant noodles and a granola bar, but I ate slowly, savoring the solitude. A fire crackled low nearby, embers popping faintly, casting dancing shadows across the tent walls. The smell of smoke mixed with pine resin, sharp and clean. I listened as the forest shifted from day to night, the air cooling rapidly, carrying the scent of damp soil and fallen leaves. I felt insulated from the world, cocooned in my little clearing. Sleep came eventually, though I left the tent flap partially open, the mesh allowing the night air to drift in, carrying with it the distant cries of owls and the faint rustle of nocturnal animals. Hours passed, or so I thought, until a light pricked at my consciousness. At first, I thought it was a trick of the moon, a reflection on the tent wall. Then I realized it wasn't the moon. A narrow beam of white light swept across the fabric. Slow, deliberate, scanning. Back and forth. My heart stopped. I froze, muscles locked in place. The beam moved again, slower now, lingering near the corner where my sleeping bag lay. I could see the sharp edges of the shadow trees projected faintly on the tent walls by the light. I held my breath. No sound followed. No footsteps crunching the underbrush, no snap of a twig, no rustle of leaves. Just the light, moving, scanning, searching. I whispered to myself, maybe it's an animal, maybe it's some hiker lost. But the beam was too precise, too human. No deer or raccoon could wield a flashlight like that. I clutched my small camping knife, pressing it against my chest. I strained my ears, listening to the forest around me, the usual night sounds, punctuated only by my own uneven heartbeat. My rational mind cycled through explanations, each less comforting than the last. Perhaps someone was trying to prank me, maybe another camper had wandered off the trail. But why no sound? Why only the light? And then it stretched. My palms sweated against the fabric of the knife handle. My breathing was shallow. I considered making a run for it, bursting from the tent into the blackness. But instinct told me that would be madness. Whoever was out there could easily be waiting for that. I tried to steady myself, whispering nonsense, reminding myself it could be a reflection from the fire, from some metal I hadn't noticed. Then the beam stopped. Directly over me. I froze so completely I thought my body might crack. I could see the dark outline of the flashlight itself, the subtle wobble of its beam. It lingered for long, impossibly long seconds, and I felt that weight pressing against me, not physically, but mentally, as if someone were inside my skull, studying me. I tried to convince myself it was some optical trick, a sliver of moonlight or fire reflection, but my fingers burned from clenching the knife. I forced myself to move slightly, shifting the sleeping bag as though rearranging it could somehow protect me. Suddenly, the beam darted to the side, scanning the corner of the tent, then to the wall nearest the zipper. My stomach clenched. Whoever was out there knew exactly where I was, exactly where the entrance was. My thoughts ran wild. What if they weren't alone? What if there were more than one? What if this had been planned, this whole isolation, this silence, to lull me into complacency? I whispered into the darkness, voice hoarse. Hello? Is someone there? No response. Only the beam moving again, as if mocking me. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears, each beat echoing like the footfalls I could not hear. Then it stopped completely. I dared to inch toward the zipper, knife in hand, careful not to disturb the tent's mesh walls. I unzipped it slightly and peeked out. Nothing. The clearing was empty, the fire reduced to smoldering embers, the trees motionless in the windless night. No footprints, no flashlight. Just silence. I wanted to run, to escape, but the rational part of me hesitated. Had I imagined it? No. The memory of the light, the way it had scanned deliberately, lingered in every nerve. My rationality wavered, and I stayed low in the tent, trying to calm myself, trying to listen. Then I saw it, at the edge of the clearing. A figure, too dark to make out details, standing perfectly still just beyond the reach of the firelight. No flashlight now, no movement, just watching. My stomach dropped. I froze completely, too terrified to breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel the attention, patient and deliberate, pressing into me. I backed into the far corner of the tent, shaking. Thoughts raced. Run? Call out? Hide? The figure didn't shift. Minutes passed hours, it felt like. Then, slowly, impossibly, it vanished. No sound, no rustle, just gone, as if it had never been there. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up as quickly as I could, leaving everything behind, fire still smoldering, my gear barely zipped into the bag. My hands shook uncontrollably, and I kept glancing over my shoulder as I hiked the trail back to civilization. Every shadow, every brush, seemed alive. I told myself it was a lone hiker, maybe someone testing their nerves, maybe a prankster. But deep down, I knew better. The precision, the patience, the silence, nothing human should have moved that way. And somewhere, out there in that forest, they were still waiting, patient, deliberate, ready for the next person who thought solitude meant safety. I survived. But when I close my eyes at night, I still see the beam sweeping across the tent walls, slow and deliberate, and I know the forest remembers me. Story 19, The Photo in the Dark. I had always preferred camping alone. Not out of bravado, not for solitude's sake, but because I liked the simplicity of it. A small tent, a sleeping bag, a fire pit, and the world reduced to trees, sky, and the occasional animal sound. That weekend, I had driven deep into the Blackwood Forest, farther than I had ever gone before, following a narrow dirt road that eventually gave way to a trail barely visible beneath fallen leaves. The campsite I found was perfect, a flat clearing surrounded by dense pine, a small creek murmuring nearby, and the air so clean I could almost taste it. I pitched my tent, arranged my gear, and gathered wood for a fire. The day waned gently, the sunlight filtered through the canopy, leaving everything in warm, golden light. I cooked a simple meal, beans and sausage, toasted over the fire, and sat on a log, listening to the faint sounds of the forest, feeling a rare contentment. By 9, the fire had burned down to embers. I brushed my teeth, crawled into my sleeping bag, and left the tent flap slightly open for ventilation. The night was quiet, the sort of deep, rolling quiet that seems to hold its breath alongside you. I drifted off almost immediately, soothed by the subtle rustle of leaves and the distant rush of the creek. I woke at some indeterminate hour. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a strange, insistent vibration that pulled me from sleep like a hook in my chest. I fumbled for it, blinking against the dim glow of the tent, my heart stuttering when I saw the screen. A message from an unknown number. I unlocked it, expecting spam, perhaps a delayed notification, and froze. There, in full color, was a photograph. And I was in it. My sleeping bag, my tent, my face turned toward the flap, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, utterly vulnerable. I sat upright so fast I nearly hit my head on the tent frame. My stomach lurched, and the edges of panic cut through the calm I had cultivated all evening. The photo had been taken from outside, looking in. My pulse hammered in my ears. I told myself it was impossible, no one had been here. I was far from any road, far from anyone who might stumble across me. I had double-checked everything before bed. I checked the surrounding forest through the mesh of the tent. Shadows lay still, swaying faintly in the moonlight. No flashlight beams, no glint of a watch or phone, nothing. The wind was calm. Silence pressed against the tent like a hand. I wanted to rationalize it, maybe a prank, maybe someone had followed me unnoticed, but the thought was absurd. The nearest campsite was miles away. The nearest road farther still. Another buzz. Another message. My hand shook violently as I grabbed the phone. Another photo, this one closer. My head, my shoulders, my chest. The angle had changed slightly, angled from above, as if whoever or whatever was taking the pictures had circled the tent. I felt my throat tighten. My rational mind fought to assert itself. Maybe a drone? A wildlife camera? Something mechanical? But the photos were too precise, too deliberate. The darkness outside the tent seemed to thicken. I could feel it watching, patient and silent. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap slowly, poking the beam into the surrounding trees. The forest stared back, empty, unnervingly still. My stomach churned. I couldn't see movement, but I could feel it, the sensation of being observed so intensely that it pressed against your skin. My mind raced through every horror story, every news article I had ever read about people disappearing in forests. Every single one now seemed plausible. I decided I had to move, had to escape, but panic and rational thought collided. Should I run? Should I stay? What if whoever had taken these photos was still out there, waiting for me to make a mistake? I packed quickly, tossing essentials into my bag, grabbing water, matches, and my knife. The forest, silent and still, offered no guidance, no comfort. I slipped from the tent, sticking to the shadows, listening. No sounds. No twigs snapping, no rustle of leaves, nothing. I tried to convince myself it was over, that the photographs had been sent from some prankster in the distant town, but I couldn't shake the gnawing sense that I was still being observed. The creek glinted faintly in the moonlight, and I decided to follow it, hoping it would lead to the main trail. My steps were careful, slow, deliberate, ear-straining. Then, behind me, I heard it, a faint click. The unmistakable sound of a camera shutter, distant but precise, coming from somewhere behind the line of trees. I broke into a run. Branches tore at my arms and legs, roots snagged my boots, but I didn't stop. Another shutter, closer this time. I dared to glance over my shoulder. The darkness was absolute, and yet I could feel the presence there, tracking me, moving with an impossible silence, deliberate, patient. The trail eventually widened, leading to a fire road I recognized from the map. I sprinted along it, lungs burning, hands trembling, until finally, lights of distant houses pierced the tree-line. I didn't slow until I reached the first driveway, pounding on the door until someone opened. I explained breathlessly, trying not to cry, to make them understand, but they looked at me skeptically, calling the police, who found no one. No footprints. No drone. No sign of any presence except the trail I had run along and the messages still sitting on my phone, untouched. I returned home, shaken but intact. I never went back to that campsite. And sometimes, when I am alone at night, my phone buzzes not with another photo, but with the memory of the beam of those unseen eyes, patient, deliberate, tracking, watching. I survived. I escaped the forest. But I know, with a certainty I cannot explain, that I was never unobserved. And somewhere, out there in the darkness of the woods, it waits, patient, deliberate, and ready for the next solitary camper. Story 20, the handprints on the car. I had been driving for hours, the hum of the tires against the asphalt and the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers acting as a lullaby. It was late autumn, the rain a constant drizzle, smudging the streetlights into watery halos as I followed the empty highway north. I was exhausted, muscles aching, eyes burning. My plan had been simple: reach the small cabin I rented before nightfall. But the fog rolled in faster than expected, thick and clinging, wrapping the road in a gray shroud. I spotted a lay-by ahead, a narrow gravel shoulder with enough space to pull over safely. I eased the car onto it, the tires crunching against loose stones. I left the engine running for a moment to keep the heater on, then killed it, letting the car fall silent except for the muted patter of rain on the roof. I leaned back in the seat, stretched my arms over my head, and closed my eyes, just for a few minutes. My body demanded sleep, and the hypnotic rhythm of the rain made it easy to give in. I must have dozed for longer than I intended. My eyes fluttered open to an unsettling stillness. The rain had lightened, the fog now a thin veil over the road. Something felt different. A chill pressed against the windows, and I noticed the outside lights of passing cars had gone. Absolute quiet. My car felt oddly isolated, like it had been dropped into an empty world. Then I saw them. Handprints. Smudged, greasy, desperate handprints across the windshield, smeared down the glass in a pattern of fingers splayed wide. My breath caught, the sound loud in the enclosed space. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, certain it had been locked, certain I hadn't seen anyone nearby when I pulled over. My pulse thundered in my ears, every instinct screaming that this was wrong. I scanned the surrounding area through the rain-speckled side window. The lay-by was empty, drenched gravel and slick asphalt, the forest behind it a wall of darkness. No footprints. No shadow. No vehicle. Only the handprints, taunting me with their silent insistence. I tried to rationalize. Maybe a drunk driver, someone who had passed and pressed their hands on the glass. But the patterns weren't random, they weren't fleeting. They were deliberate, almost calculated, as if the person had taken their time to ensure I saw them when I woke. The thought rooted me to the seat. I reached for my phone. No signal. My fingers hovered over the dial tone, trembling. The car seemed smaller suddenly, the wet glass pressing close to my skin, the shadows outside whispering promises I couldn't quite hear. My rational mind attempted to reassure me. Maybe it was a prank, a local kid daring me, some joke gone too far. But the forest beyond the lay-by offered no road, no trail, no signs of life. I considered leaving, driving immediately to the next town, but fear weighed me down like lead. Every muscle tensed. What if the person was hiding, waiting for me to start the car? I stared at the handprints again, noticing the details, streaks of something darker than water, the pressure points of knuckles, the drag marks along the glass. Someone had been close enough to reach me, close enough to breathe against the cold metal of my car, and yet I hadn't heard a thing. I tried the doors. Locked. Thank God. But the instinctual terror didn't fade. I imagined hands pressing against the glass from all sides, figures emerging from the mist, breath fogging the windows, slow deliberate movements in perfect silence. Every rational explanation evaporated in the cold air of my chest. My body wanted to bolt, but my mind froze in indecision, caught between disbelief and terror. Minutes or hours, it felt like the past. My imagination raced, constructing scenarios I could not bear to consider. The forest seemed alive, its branches scratching at the air like fingers reaching for me. I wanted to scream, to call someone, anyone, but my phone was a useless rectangle of black, the rain muting every sound outside. Finally, I forced myself to move. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine groaned awake, a small comfort. My hands were slick on the wheel, pulse thundering. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing. No figure, no vehicle, no motion. The handprints had not vanished from the windshield, but the terror now came from their implication. Someone had been here, had studied me while I slept, and had left without a sound. I drove. Slowly at first, then faster, eyes darting to every shadow at the road's edge, every tree that seemed too close, every darkened curve in the asphalt. I didn't stop until I reached the lights of a gas station 20 minutes down the road, hands white-knuckled around the wheel, pulse still racing. I stayed in the car until sunrise, staring at the rearview mirror, making sure no one followed. Later, the handprints washed away in a brief afternoon rain, leaving only a faint smear on the glass. I told myself it had been someone local, a prankster taking advantage of isolation. Rational explanations, comforting lies. But even weeks later, whenever I drive alone on empty roads, I imagine the handprints returning, smeared across the windshield in the middle of the night. Waiting. Watching. I survived that night. But I know now how easily the line between safe and vulnerable can disappear. And I know, deep down, that if I ever stop again in some lonely place, the hands will be there, patient, deliberate, and waiting for me to close my eyes. Story 21, The Silent Night Shift. The diner was nearly empty when I arrived for my night shift. Only a handful of regulars lingered at this hour, construction workers finishing late shifts, a solitary trucker sipping lukewarm coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, humming in a way that made the ceiling tiles feel too low, the air heavy with the smell of frying grease and stale sugar. I clocked in, poured myself a cup of coffee, and ran through the usual opening checks, ovens off, coffee machines primed, freezers at temperature. Everything normal, mundane, exactly how it should be. The night started quietly, the kind of quiet that makes you acutely aware of every small sound, the drip of the sink, the low hum of the refrigerator, the occasional squeak of a chair as someone shifted in their booth. I liked this time of night, the solitude, the sense that the world had pressed pause outside the diner's walls. Around 2 a.m., the lights flickered briefly, a quick, almost imperceptible dip before stabilizing again. I muttered under my breath, blaming the old wiring, and continued to tidy up the counter. Moments later, it happened again, a longer flicker, accompanied by the faint smell of burnt plastic. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was nothing. Old buildings creak and spark. That's all. I decided to check the phone lines. Just a precaution. The landline sat on the wall behind the counter, off its cradle. I picked it up and dialed the number for the local police station. Nothing. Silence. I tried the backup number. Still nothing. My fingers trembled slightly as I checked the other phone in the office. Dead. Not a dial tone, not a click, not a whisper of static. I tried to rationalize it. A blown fuse? A temporary outage? I moved to the breaker panel in the kitchen, flipping switches one by one. Lights blinked but held steady. The rest of the diner seemed unaffected. The phones remained stubbornly dead. Anxiety settled over me like a wet blanket. Something was wrong. Then came the sound. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, a dragging noise from the back hallway, like metal scraping against tile. My hands gripped the counter, knuckles white. The diner was old, the pipes occasionally groaned, and rodents sometimes made mischief, but this sounded deliberate. Slow. Methodical. The dragging noise stopped abruptly near the office door. My stomach sank. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm. I rationalized maybe a raccoon had somehow gotten inside. But the sound had stopped at the office. There were no vents, no hidden crawl spaces. Nothing should be in there. And the phones were dead. I crept toward the office door, knife clenched in one hand, flashlight in the other. The air was heavy, the fluorescent lights flickering occasionally, casting shadows that swayed as if alive. I reached for the door handle. My hand was slick with sweat. The dragging sound started again, this time behind me, coming from the dining area. I froze. My mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps an intruder? But the diner had a single entrance, a door I had checked myself. The back exit was locked, the windows barred. Whoever or whatever was here had not entered in any conventional way. Fear wrapped tighter around my chest. I turned slowly, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The booths were empty, the chairs perfectly aligned, the coffee machines humming. Nothing moved. No shadows beyond those cast by the flickering lights. I returned my gaze to the office door. The handle rattled slightly, as if someone had brushed it, testing it. My pulse threatened to burst my ribs. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and shallow, echoing too loudly in the quiet space. Rationality and fear collided violently in my mind. Maybe it was the wiring, maybe a loose hinge, maybe... No! This was deliberate. Someone was here. I remembered the landline. If the phones were dead, I couldn't call for help. I was completely isolated. My stomach knotted. The dragging noise resumed, now coming from just outside the office, circling slowly, like it was tracing my movements. I forced myself to step back, retreating toward the exit. Every instinct screamed to run, but I knew the door alone would not save me. Whoever was here had watched me for hours, moving silently, deliberately, testing boundaries. I needed a plan. The lights flickered violently, and for a moment, the diner was plunged into darkness. My flashlight slipped in my hand, illuminating only fragments of the room, a tipped chair, a coffee cup on the floor, a dark smear along the tile. I heard breathing then, not mine. Shallow, measured, behind the office door. The lights returned. I shined the flashlight at the office, and there it was. A shadow, taller than it should be, standing perfectly still in the corner, just beyond the desk. No features, just darkness, like a void. My mouth went dry. I took a step back, heart hammering, and the shadow tilted its head, as if acknowledging me, deliberate and patient. I bolted for the back exit, fumbling with the lock, swinging the door open. Cold night air hit me like a wall. I ran across the parking lot, not daring to look back until I reached my car. I started the engine, doors locked, hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the wheel. As I drove, headlights catching the flicker of the diner in the rearview mirror, I saw the office window. The shadow was gone, but the feeling remained. Watching, patient, deliberate. The phone still dead, the fluorescent lights flickering, the silence inside the building louder than any scream. I survived the night. I reported it, but nothing was found. Wiring intact. Doors locked. Phones operational. And yet, I know what I felt, what I heard. The deliberate patience. The calculated silence. And I know that if I ever return, it will still be there waiting, always waiting. Story 22, The Shifting Trail. I had always loved the solitude of the mountains. The way the forest swallowed you, the crunch of pine needles beneath your boots, the faint scent of moss and wet earth. It was a world I could step into and leave the weight of everything else behind. That weekend, I was hiking alone along the Eldridge Trail, a rugged path far enough from roads that had promised uninterrupted isolation. My pack was light, the essentials only, and I had left my phone at home deliberately. No distractions, just me, the trail, and the quiet. The day had begun ordinarily enough, a brisk morning air, the sun filtering through branches in thin, golden shafts, birds trilling in the distance. I set a comfortable pace, pausing occasionally to admire a waterfall or photograph a particularly gnarled pine. The trail markers, small strips of red tape tied to branches, guided me clearly. I noted them absent-mindedly but trusted them, as hikers do. By mid-afternoon, the sky had clouded over. A low mist began to weave between the trees, dampening the forest floor, making every footfall slick with dew. I didn't mind, it was atmospheric, serene even. I reached a small ridge with a breathtaking view of the valley below, paused to drink water, and made a mental note of the last few trail markers. I was careful, cautious, I always paid attention, but nothing seemed out of place. Hours passed. I realized the sun had dipped far earlier than expected. Shadows thickened, and the mist seemed to become heavier, curling around the trunks of trees like smoke. My pace slowed. I checked my map. According to it, I should have reached the turnoff for my campsite by now. And yet, the markers weren't what they should have been. At first, I blamed my exhaustion. The forest is confusing in low light, paths curve in strange ways, trees resemble each other. I circled back to the last known marker. It was gone. My stomach tightened. I retraced my steps another 100 meters, another marker gone, replaced, somehow, with one pointing in the opposite direction. Panic began to bubble beneath the surface. I told myself rational explanations. Perhaps another hiker had come along, correcting what they saw as misplaced tape. But my mind rejected this too easily. I was certain I had seen those markers earlier. And now, every time I thought I was heading in the right direction, the path twisted back on itself, doubling, looping, almost mockingly. As twilight faded into near darkness, I noticed small, subtle inconsistencies. A branch I remembered snapped differently, a patch of moss disturbed where it hadn't been, my footprints partially erased in the soft soil. Someone or something was following, observing, manipulating the trail behind me. My heart pounded. I tried to calm myself, speaking aloud as the words could anchor me. It's just a prank, that's all. Someone's moving markers for fun. Nothing dangerous. But the forest's silence contradicted me. No laughter, no snapping twig from a distance, only the eerie stillness of deep woods. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper, every rustle of leaves like measured breathing. I began leaving my own markers, tying scraps of cloth to branches, scratching lines in bark. Yet as I progressed, I noticed them again, my own markers, slightly shifted, replaced, erased. My pace became frantic, my steps erratic. Hours passed in a blur of anxiety and cold sweat. The fog was thicker now, so dense that the world shrank to a few feet around me. I called out, shouting my presence into the mist, and the echo returned hollow, mocking. Then I saw it, or rather, glimpsed it. A movement too quick, too fluid to be human, slipping between trees, disappearing whenever I turned fully. My breath came in shallow gasps. My rational mind screamed that it was a deer, or the play of shadows. But the methodical tampering with the trail markers, the erasure of my path, the precise timing of the disturbance, nothing about this could be accidental. I ran. Feet tearing through undergrowth, branches slashing my face, roots tangling in my boots. Every direction seemed the same, every path led me back to the same moss-covered clearing. My markers were gone. Panic clawed at my chest. I stumbled into a shallow depression in the forest, gasping, exhausted. And then I saw it clearly. In the dim moonlight, barely visible through the mist, a figure crouched near the trail, indistinct but unmistakably human, rearranging the markers I had just tied. It paused when it noticed me, head tilting unnaturally, motion deliberate enough to send a chill through my marrow. Its hands moved quickly, erasing and repositioning, as though the forest itself were being rewritten under its control. I understood then with a horrifying clarity. I was trapped. Every path I had taken, every marker I had trusted, was subject to its whim. The forest had become a cage, and it was the warden. My attempts to escape were futile. Every choice, every turn, only ensured my continued disorientation. I backed away slowly, keeping my gaze on it. The figure remained motionless now, a shadow blending with shadows, patient, methodical. My breath fogged in the chill air. My mind raced, trying to remember any path, any landmark that could offer safety, but the mist and darkness had erased them all. I ran blindly, following instinct rather than reason, crashing through underbrush, stumbling over roots. Eventually, I reached a clearing with a faint light in the distance, a road. Salvation, or so I hoped. I emerged onto the asphalt, collapsing to my knees, gasping, my eyes scanning the treeline. Nothing followed. Nothing moved. I did not stop until I reached the nearest town, hours later, drenched, bleeding from minor cuts, shaking uncontrollably. I reported what happened to the rangers, but no trace was found. The trail markers had returned to their original positions, no sign of any tampering. They told me I must have gotten lost, disoriented in the fog. But I know better. I survived. I escaped the forest. And yet, every time I hike alone now, I find myself glancing behind me, imagining small hands subtly shifting my path, patient, deliberate, waiting until I am lost again. I will never hike the Eldridge Trail alone again. And I know, deep down, the figure is still there, somewhere, moving unseen, ensuring no one ever truly leaves its domain. Story 23, The Footprints Behind Me. I had taken to jogging in the early morning hours, long before the city stirred. The path I liked was secluded, a narrow dirt trail winding along the river, bordered by trees and underbrush that blurred the world outside. The air was crisp, scented faintly of wet leaves and moss. My sneakers struck the damp ground rhythmically, a solitary drumbeat in the quiet. It was ordinary, peaceful, exactly what I wanted. That morning began as any other. I left my apartment before sunrise, stretching at the trailhead, the cold air filling my lungs. A soft mist hovered over the water, and the first pale light of dawn made the world silver. I set off at a steady pace, earbuds in, music low, just enough to keep a rhythm. Everything was normal. I had been running for perhaps 20 minutes when I noticed the first oddity. The ground was muddy from last night's rain, and the soft impressions of shoes pressed into it were crisp. I glanced down at my own footprints, noting the familiar pattern of my sneakers, the careful spacing I always maintained. That's when I saw it, a second set of prints, slightly offset, following mine almost perfectly. I stopped, held my breath. The second set was identical in size and stride. My pulse jumped, but I tried to convince myself it was coincidence. Maybe another jogger had passed moments after me, following the same route. A plausible explanation, I told myself. Still, the prints were unnervingly precise, the timing uncanny. I resumed running, faster this time, glancing over my shoulder. The mist blurred the trail behind me. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, a trick of light and shadow. But the prints continued, appearing in the mud exactly a few minutes behind me, following my pace, my rhythm. Every stride mirrored mine. I picked up speed, the soft thump of my sneakers now joined by the faint but distinct impressions that always appeared behind me, as if the trail itself were alive, mimicking my movements. Anxiety gnawed at me. I rationalized. Someone could have been jogging stealthily, matching my pace, watching me. Maybe a coincidence, maybe a prank. But then came the noises. At first, subtle, a crack of a twig, soft, measured. I stopped abruptly, straining to listen. The path behind me was empty, or so I told myself. I told myself that the sounds were my imagination, a natural echo in the mist. But every time I ran, the impressions in the mud followed, and now faint, deliberate snaps and rustles accompanied them, perfectly timed with my steps. My rational mind began to unravel. No one could match me so precisely through mud and fog. It wasn't humanly possible. And yet, each time I glanced over my shoulder, the trail appeared empty. The prints remained flawless, the evidence of a presence I could not see. I began to run recklessly, the mist thickening around me, the world shrinking to the width of the path. Heart pounding, breath sharp, I tried every trick, quick turns, doubling back, sprinting in zigzags. Every time I looked back, no one. Yet the prints reappeared, always a few moments behind, perfectly spaced, perfectly aligned with my pace. Panic set in. My mind screamed with warnings, memories of every horror story I'd ever heard rising in vivid color. Something was following me. Something deliberate, patient, and impossibly precise. My rational explanations collapsed under the weight of the evidence. The prints did not tire, did not falter, did not deviate. Whoever or whatever was behind me could mimic me perfectly. And I was running out of trail. I reached a clearing by the river, open ground where I could see the path stretching back in a silver haze. My own footprints ended abruptly, but so did the second set, stopping at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the shadow of the trees. I froze. My chest heaved. The mist swirled, and I strained to see, to find some clue of the presence, some sign of a figure I could comprehend. Then I saw it, or thought I did. A flicker in the corner of my vision, low, crouched, humanoid but wrong. Too small, too fast, slipping through the fog like liquid shadow. It moved deliberately, and every motion suggested anticipation, patience, a focus entirely on me. My stomach turned to lead. I realized then that this was not an ordinary stalker, not a coincidence. Whatever it was had been tracking me, mirroring me, unseen and impossibly close. I ran blindly down the path toward the next bridge, ears straining for any sound, hands clawing at my legs in a desperate bid for speed. Every few strides, I glanced back. The trail was empty, but the prints always resumed, appearing exactly where I had been. My breath was ragged, lungs burning. My legs screamed, yet I could not stop. Finally, the trail opened onto the road. Streetlights bathed the path in harsh yellow, casting the mist aside. The prints vanished in the light, and I realized with a shiver that they never crossed into open ground. They only existed in the fog, in the shadows, in the confined forest. I leaned against the railing of the bridge, trembling, eyes scanning the tree-line. Nothing. No shadow. No figure. Only silence. I walked home slowly, every sense alert, every noise magnified. The rational explanations no longer worked. There was no humanly explanation for what had followed me, the perfect pacing, the exact timing, the impossibility of sighting anything. I survived the morning, but I never jogged that trail again. Even now, whenever I hear footsteps behind me in empty streets, the same meticulous, perfect timing of that unseen presence echoes in my mind. And I know, deep down, that if I returned to that fog, to that forest path, it would be waiting, matching my pace, always a few minutes behind. Patient. Relentless. Inescapable. Story 24, The Watching Car. I had chosen this campsite for its remoteness, the kind of place where the trees grew thick and the river cut a silver ribbon through the valley. It was a perfect getaway, no cell phone signal, no crowds, just the quiet of the forest. I set up my tent near a cluster of pines, stacked firewood carefully, and watched the sun dip behind the hills as I cooked my dinner over the flickering flame. The ordinary details comforted me, the warmth of the fire, the smell of pine needles, the distant call of a lone owl. The first night was peaceful. The forest hummed with the usual nocturnal life, insects chirping, the low rustle of branches in the wind. I went to sleep wrapped in my sleeping bag, lulled by the rhythmic sound of the river. Around midnight, I woke to a faint glint through the mesh of my tent. Squinting, I could just make out the shape of a car parked at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't unusual for a hiker to be passing through, I told myself, and soon I drifted back to sleep. Morning came with birdsong and sunlight spilling through the trees. I packed up my camp briefly to fetch water from the river. On my return, I froze. The car was gone. A coincidence, I thought. Perhaps the driver had spent the night somewhere else, just passing through. I shrugged it off and continued my day, hiking along a nearby ridge, letting the ordinary beauty of the forest calm me. The second night, as darkness swallowed the campsite, I again saw the headlights through the trees, faint at first, then brighter as the vehicle settled into the same position, facing my tent. My heart skipped a beat. 3 nights of camping in the middle of nowhere, and this car had appeared twice. I told myself I was imagining things, the effect of isolation, but unease crept in like a cold draft. Every sound seemed amplified, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the river murmuring like whispered threats. I lay awake, listening, but the car stayed silent, engine off, shadowed and still. I tried rational explanations. Perhaps a park ranger, someone doing late-night patrols? Maybe another camper had parked nearby and left the headlights on. But there were no other campsites within miles, and the road leading here was little more than a dirt track, hardly visible on most maps. My logic faltered under the weight of the impossible consistency. Same car, same position, same facing angle. By the third day, my unease had grown into a gnawing fear. I packed my supplies and went on a longer hike, circling far from my tent, trying to convince myself it was just coincidence. Returning near dusk, the car was there again. Same model, same dark color, headlights faintly glinting, facing me. My stomach twisted. Someone had been here every night, watching. Always watching. That night, sleep was impossible. I kept the fire small, flickering shadows dancing across the trees. Every snapping branch made me jump. Every distant animal call sounded like deliberate movement. I lay in my tent, muscles tense, flashlight within reach, listening. Around 1 a.m., a faint crunch of gravel reached my ears. I froze, straining. The sound stopped, then resumed closer, deliberate, calculated. I unzipped the tent slowly, peering through the mesh. The car's headlights were off, but the dark shape of the vehicle remained perfectly still. My throat went dry as I noticed something I hadn't before, faint impressions in the dirt where someone had walked, leading toward the clearing, circling my tent. No footprints led away. My pulse raced. Whoever had come here had left without a trace, just like the car, always present, always silent, always facing me. I tried to reason. Maybe it was a camper setting up pranks. Maybe someone lost and harmless. But my instincts screamed otherwise. The precision of the car's placement, the footprints that appeared and disappeared, the feeling of being watched, it was deliberate. I could not escape the gaze of whoever or whatever was here. Hours passed. My flashlight cut weak beams into the black, showing only trees, firelight, and shadows. Then movement, a figure stepping from the tree leaning toward the car. It paused, silhouetted by moonlight, and I noticed the way it didn't move like a human. Jerky, cautious, deliberate. My stomach roiled as I realized the figure had been watching the fire, my movements, waiting for me to sleep. I gathered my courage. I could not stay. Every nerve screamed to flee. I grabbed my pack, my sleeping bag, and ran. The ground was slick, roots catching my boots. Behind me, I heard nothing, no vehicle engine, no footsteps, but a presence seemed to trail me, patient, unseen. I did not dare look back. I ran until the forest thinned and the dirt road appeared, the safety of the main road within reach. By dawn, I was driving back toward town, checking the rearview mirror obsessively. The clearing where I had camped was empty, and the car nowhere in sight. I did not stop. I do not know who or what it was, and I do not want to. The prints, the car, the figure, it had been deliberate, meticulous, patient. Waiting. I have not returned to that forest. I have not camped alone since. But even now, when I pass quiet roads or empty fields, I imagine headlights in the distance, always facing me, always waiting. Story 25, The Morning Stones. I had always sought out solitude in the wilderness. The kind of silence that pressed against your ears, that made even your own heartbeat feel intrusive. That weekend, I drove hours from the city to pitch my tent in a valley tucked deep within the Ravenwood Forest, a place where the trees grew so densely that sunlight scarcely touched the mossy floor. I carried only the essentials, a sleeping bag, a small backpack, a lighter, and enough food for 2 days. The first evening was ordinary. I set up camp, stacking firewood in a careful semicircle, arranging small stones around the base of the pit. The The scent of pine hung thick in the air, and a gentle wind rustled the leaves, carrying with it the faint, sweet tang of wet earth. I lit the fire, watching the flames lick the logs as darkness fell. Stars emerged, cold and distant, and the river murmured softly in the distance. By 10, I was exhausted. I crawled into my sleeping bag, leaving the fire smoldering slightly, confident it would burn out on its own. The night passed uneventfully, filled with the usual sounds of forest life, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a branch, the sigh of wind moving through the canopy. When dawn broke, a soft pink light filtered through the pines. I stretched and reached for the zipper of my tent, expecting the familiar sight of my little campsite. I froze. Where the fire had been, a pile of rocks sat, stacked neatly into a small, perfect cone. Every stone balanced carefully atop the other. My carefully arranged fire pit, the ashes, the logs, the scorched stones had vanished, replaced by this structure. I stepped out of the tent slowly, scanning the area. The firewood I had gathered was untouched beside the stack, the ground undisturbed in any other direction. My stomach churned. I was alone, or so I had thought. I tried to rationalize. Maybe a deer had knocked over the fire pit, though that wouldn't explain the precise stacking. Perhaps a bird or a raccoon had moved the stones, yet the sheer tear, the symmetry of the pile, was impossible for any animal. My mind grasped for explanation, but my instinct screamed otherwise. Someone or something had been at my campsite while I slept. I packed up my gear quickly, every rustle of leaves under my boots making me jump. The forest that had felt serene the night before now seemed oppressive. Shadows clung to the trees, the mist curling at the edges of the clearing, and every sound was amplified, the distant trickle of the river, the creak of a branch, the soft whisper of wind through pine needles. My pulse hammered in my ears. I told myself I must be imagining it, that fatigue had warped my perception. But as I hiked, I noticed subtle signs, small depressions in the soil near the tree line, slight displacements of moss, a faint metallic glint from a stone that had been entirely flat yesterday. Someone or something had observed me, had moved silently and deliberately. Nightfall came again, and I made camp farther up the ridge, determined to keep a fire this time. I arranged the wood and stones carefully, watching the light from the fire flicker across the clearing. I stayed alert, ears straining for the slightest sound, my eyes scanning the forest edge. Hours passed. Nothing. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Morning revealed the same impossibility. I awoke to find the fire pit gone again. In its place, another pile of rocks, even more meticulously stacked than before, some stones impossibly balanced, as if someone had handled them with infinite care. My firewood lay untouched beside it, but the pit I had painstakingly built, the ashes, the charred logs, had vanished entirely. Fear replaced rationality. I packed immediately, abandoning the firewood, the gear I didn't need. I moved faster, scanning constantly. Shadows seemed to flicker at the periphery of my vision. Every bird call, every rustle of leaves, every snap of twigs sounded like deliberate footsteps. I could feel eyes on me, unseen but attentive, tracking every motion. By the time I reached the trailhead, my pace was frantic. I glanced back once, half expecting to see someone or something emerging from the trees. There was nothing. Just the pale light of morning and the quiet of the forest. I tried to tell myself it was some prankster, perhaps another camper, though no one else had been in this part of the forest for miles. The thought of a human being capable of such precision, of approaching silently while I slept, of balancing stones perfectly in the night, it was almost worse than believing in something inhuman. Weeks later, I returned to the forest on a guided hike, pointing out where I had camped. The clearing had grown over. No evidence remained of my encounter, no fire pit, no carefully stacked stones, nothing to suggest that anyone or anything had been there at all. I told myself it was a hallucination, stress-induced, a trick of memory. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can see those rocks. The perfect symmetry, the careful balance, and the silent message left behind. I had been watched, and the observer had visited me while I slept. I will never camp in that forest alone again. I have tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that it was some natural phenomenon, some clever prank. But I know the truth. I know someone or something was there. And if I ever return to those trees, I will not be alone.